体は剣でできている。獅子は鉄で心はガラス。幾度の戦場を越えて腐敗。ただ一度の敗走もなく、ただ一度の勝利もなし。担い手はここに一人。剣の奥で鉄を打つ。ならば我が生涯に意味はいらず。この体は無限の剣でできていた。
Japanimation Station.
Hello and welcome to Japanimation Station, an anime podcast brought to you by the folks at the Weekly Stuff Podcast. I am Sean Chapman.
And I'm Jonathan Lack.
And we are here once again to dive into the wild and wacky world of anime. This week on the show, we are covering the second and final season of Fate Stay Night Unlimited Blade Works. It's weird to call them seasons because it is just two. It's really two cores. But the back half of the show, a podcast I've been very excited to record because, Jonathan, you now have seen an adaptation of one of the complete roots from Fate Stay Night, which feels like a very big milestone for you in the world of anime.
It's pretty good. I think these people might be onto something. I think this is pretty good. I'd like to see more. If they have a pamphlet, I will sign up for it.
Yes, I have seen this show several times at this point. And like Fate Zero, enough times that I don't remember how many times I've seen it all the way through. I've obviously played the game. I've played the game twice. So I know this story very well. I love this story. I love this show. But Jonathan, this is your first time seeing it, and now you have seen the fullness of Unlimited Blade Works, all of those blades, all of those works. What'd you think?
Well, obviously, I was very positive on it coming out of season 1, which we talked about last week, and I loved it. And that, of course, takes us up through episode 12, which is really 16 episodes worth of content. And then these are the final 13. And, at the end of that first season, you have, Shirou and Rin both kind of recommitting to a new direction after the sort of Dark Empire Strikes Back-esque ending of losing Saber and all of that. And season 2, we talked a little bit about how season 1 is, very character-focused and not particularly plot-heavy. And then season 2 is all the story. It is off like a bullet. It is very propulsive. I was not able to spread these episodes out until like Sunday morning or something when we record this. It was just, I finished them on like Wednesday or Thursday. I just went through them like, they were just, it's a phenomenal set of episodes. Obviously, huge plot revelations. I think it really brings into focus what this particular story is actually about. It's, really interesting. In the main, this is a story that is a dialogue between Shirou Emiya and himself. Sometimes very literally, because as we learn, spoiler warning, Archer is actually Saber, or that would be a very different story. Archer is actually Shirou, excuse me. And this whole, especially the last like 5 or 6 episodes, there's some obviously fantastic action and great, Gilgamesh we will talk about because boy howdy Tomokazu Seki makes a fucking meal out of the final episodes of Unlimited Blade Works. But at its core, it really is about this one character and his journey and again, this kind of dialogue with himself after this almost like Charles Dickens Christmas Carol-esque meeting of the ghost of Christmas future through Archer and what's going to happen with that. And I'll admit, it left me, so the penultimate episode resolves the actual action, right? and then the final episode is an epilogue. And the penultimate episode, I was just on cloud nine. There's the moment where Archer finishes the job on Gilgamesh, and I basically stood up and yelled, "Fuck yeah," because it's so good, and it's so satisfying. And then the epilogue, I think, complicates things in a not dissimilar way to the epilogue of Kara no Kyokai for me, and left me kind of thinking about it and chewing on it, and I was not really sure what I thought of it. Not in a, is this good, is this bad, but like, what is it saying? How satisfied are we supposed to be with the answers that Shirou has found and we are given? Is this a happy ending? Is it a mixed ending? Is it actually a very, very dark ending when you really think about it? It gives you a lot to chew on, and of course, along the way, just incredible animation and music. It's the complete package of a show. It's very good. And I do think there's a couple of points that we'll talk about that don't quite follow up as, a sequel to Fate Zero, but there's a lot of stuff that does. I mean, I think because Unlimited Blade Works winds up being so focused on Shirou's specific journey and his goals as he inherited them from Kiritsugu, this is actually a shockingly perfect sequel. Thematically, they're so closely linked, you'd believe that I think one naturally followed the other. And of course they did, just the other way around. Yes. And so it mostly works in that sense too. And that is also just incredibly impressive. And I am champing at the bit to watch Heaven's Feel. So I know this is kind of long and rambling, but this is a lot of show to try to summarize your thoughts on, other than just saying, holy shit, this is a fucking great show. But that's not what you came here for. You came here for deeper thoughts than that.
Yeah, but I think you're seeing one of the reasons why I really wanted to make sure that we split this podcast specifically between the two seasons is because even though season 1 has about 3 episodes more runtime of total content, season 2 is so fucking dense with stuff, because that's where the majority of the payoff for all the plot stuff comes from. That I wanted to make sure that when we got to Fate Stay Night that we could have all the sort of fun opening character conversations and the world building and all of that for one podcast episode. And then it was we need to have a whole podcast just to deal with everything that is going on in the second season. Because yes, you are also blessed, Jonathan, amongst the anime viewers of the Fate franchise, in that you don't have to wait years and years and years to see the movies for Heaven's Feel, because I think a lot of the things you're sort of hinting at about, there's some stuff that maybe doesn't fully get paid off or feels kind of unsatisfactory coming off of Fate Zero, or even I think in the scope of Unlimited Blade Works in and of itself, that is stuff that you will get in Heaven's Feel. Kotomini Kide, for instance, is not a particularly major character really in Unlimited Blade Works. It's the only route from Fate Stay Night in which Kotomine is a pretty minor figure. He's a much bigger character in Heaven's Feel. So it's some of those kinds of things, or Ilya is also a much bigger character. She's in this a decent amount, but she's much bigger in the other two routes. And then Sakura obviously is a whole huge thing that just goes completely unaddressed. She doesn't even show up. I forgot. She doesn't show up in the second season at all, other than a visual cameo in the last episode. And so those things, I think you can feel with Unlimited Blade Works that it isn't meant to be the full package. It is one part of a much bigger story. It's just that bigger story is delivered in a way that's unconventional, because it's not traditional sequels or whatever. It is alternate takes on the story. And luckily, we will be able to just move on to the Heaven's Feel movies. But I think there's something about the reason I'm talking about this is the ending thing you're talking about. The sense from the epilogue, which about half of that epilogue is actually original material made purely for the anime to kind of expand on the existing epilogue from the game. Is meant to, I think, unsettle you with the conclusion, because this isn't the full ending to the story. It is meant to be kind of have we reached a real answer here? And I think that's one of the things that's very fascinating about Unlimited Blade Works, is that it is both a complete story in and of itself, and it is also in some ways a setup for ideas that will be expanded upon in the Heaven's Feel movies. And it gets to be both a complete story and the dark middle chapter in some ways, which is not to say that the other ones aren't also super dark, because they are, because all the shit is super dark. But that sense of being suspended a little bit by that epilogue, where you're is this the path that Shirou needs to walk? I think is really fascinating. It's one of the things that makes Unlimited Blade Works a very fun story to analyze.
Absolutely. So I'm excited to talk about it. It's wonderful. I hope I do a good job on today's podcast. I just want to come clean to the listeners. We were recording this on a Sunday afternoon after I flew out from, I was visiting my family, my brother in Portland, Oregon. I flew out 6 o'clock p.m. last night, had a layover in Denver for 8 hours just during the middle of the night. Did not sleep. You can't just, it's hard at an airport. Then got on a flight this morning that was delayed by an hour and a half, and then got home, and I took a nap, and now it's time to record the Unlimited Blade Works podcast. It will power me through. This show is good enough. I have enough thoughts on it. If this were a lesser topic, I would have canceled the podcast after all of that, but we're going to do our best here.
Yes, and I have nothing as extreme as that, but this is, from when we're recording, this is like the week after I came back from work, so I'm teaching again, and so I've had 14-year-old problems on my mind all week coming back to work. But Fate Stay Night Unlimited Blade Works is too good to delay recording this podcast. It would be painful to have to wait.
It would be very painful
to actually talk about this.
Yes. Have you been assigning all your students different Fate Stay Night routes to read as their literature this semester?
I should do that. I should absolutely. It's like, and we're doing the rated 18 version, kids. It's like,
God.
I've got a nice PC at home. It's like you got, even though it's only particularly, I think, like good in one of the routes. You still got to, you just got to see. You got to learn. You got to see, like, how do you put sex scenes into some stories that aren't designed for them. Or for this one, I think it's very obvious which scene in the original is a sex scene. And then Heaven's Feel, they actually have the sex scenes because they're important there. But
all right.
Anyways.
Yes. So let's start. I have one beef with this show, Sean. I have one beef that I want to say. The theme songs for Unlimited Blade Works are so good, it's actively distracting for the rest of the episodes. I talked about Ideal White, how much I loved it on the last one. This one, you warned us, Sean, that Brave Shine would be really good. Brave Shine is really fucking good. And it's just a constant distraction through every episode because I finished the song, it's rattling around in my head, I'm trying to pay attention to the episode, and I just want to go listen to Brave Shine again. It is the biggest failing of this show, is that the theme songs are just too good for their own good.
Yeah, usually we save the theme song conversation for the end, but I think it's appropriate for Brave Shine to just, like, put it up front like, holy fucking shit. Because Ideal White is very good. And I like it a lot. And again, I kind of said last time that I had almost kind of forgotten about that song because Brave Shine kind of overshines it in many ways. Not just because Brave Shine is really fucking good, it's also just really popular. So it's one of the most popular anime opening themes of the past 10 years easily. And yeah, when you get to Brave Shine, it's got, like, I feel like if you distilled in a library, or not in a library, in a laboratory, the, like, ideal, perfect version of the J-Rock power chord, that's what you get in Brave Shine. Like, when the fucking guitar power chords hit in the chorus of Brave Shine, it is the most, like, pure gut punch, like, powerful guitar power chords you have ever heard for a J-Rock song. I cannot get enough of it. Like, whatever they did in sort of, like, getting the sound of the guitar and, all the, like, modifications and stuff you do for their electric guitars, whatever they did, it was just, like, absolutely perfect. And it is so good.
And just, like, as good as Ame has ever been on a track in terms of the vocals. It's a beautiful shriek from the soul. The lyrics are just so perfectly tailored to the show. It is something else. It's amazing. And this is around the time when Ame starts to take over the world, right? I mean, she would have done the Unicorn Gundam themes by now.
This is not an Oath Sign scenario from Fate Zero where it's like her first song or something. She has been on plenty of stuff at this point. But Brave Shine is, like, one of her biggest hits ever.
Yes. Yeah. And it's just, I've been listening to an awful lot of Ame lately because of this, because of some other stuff I've been watching. The day we're recording this, the Nier Automata anime just premiered, and she's the theme song for that. That's great. It's just, she's everywhere, and for good reason, because she's pretty much as good as you get at this sort of thing. She and Lisa, it feels a little unfair that ufotable has locked those two down, that they apparently can just get an Ame or a Lisa track for any show or movie they ever do, because that's kind of cheating, I feel like, to get you're just automatically guaranteed great theme songs, and this is one of the greatest.
Yeah, and luckily with Amy, we have 3 more Amy songs because she does the ending theme for all the movies for Heaven's Feel. So
I'm very excited. I'm like actively resisting just going, I want to hear them so bad, but I want to hear them in the context of the movie. I'm being a good Japanimation station host, and I'm waiting. But that's great. You have another Kalafina track as our ending theme this time with Ring Your Bell. That song rocks. That's one of those songs that has a really good like lead into the end of the episode that they use really well. And then, of course, Amy didn't write one song for this season. She wrote 2, and Last Stardust is also just... It is the centerpiece of one of the centerpiece scenes of the series, and amazingly done.
Yeah, no, all the songs are great for this season. I'm very sad that this is the last Kalafina song we'll get for this season of Japanimation Station. There are other anime that they did themes for, so we might encounter Kalafina again in a future episode. But yes, the Ring Your Bell is classic. Last Stardust by Ame, which if I didn't do enough research to like fully confirm this, but it's like a very popular, at least rumor that goes around online that originally Last Stardust was going to be the opening theme, and then they realized that like it doesn't quite fit, and so they switched it to Brave Shine. I think it was the right choice. Like I think Last Stardust works so perfectly as an insert song where it does. And Brave Shine is that kind of like gets you super pumped up kind of song. Yeah. Again, I don't know if that's absolutely accurate, but if it is accurate, it was a good choice.
Yeah, I mean, I've seen different versions of that rumor. I think the Wikipedia page says it's because they felt it didn't like fit the visuals for the opening they had. That's absolutely impossible because the visuals are too coded to Brave Shine. There's literally a part where the lyric is, I raise the tip of my sword in the sky, synced to Saber raising the tip of her sword in the sky to do the Excalibur move. They clearly did not animate that to Last Stardust. But anyway, I would believe that she maybe had multiple tracks ready and, they heard them. But anyway, no, they made all the right calls. It's great. And just in case people couldn't understand sarcasm, I'm not actually complaining about Unlimited Blade Works having such good music. It is just hilarious how every episode I was so excited to just hear the theme song and then finish the episode so I could go hear the theme song again. It was a vicious cycle.
It is a very vicious cycle. I mean, I watched this season in 2 sittings, basically. I watched the first half the night after we recorded our last set of podcasts. So that Sunday evening, I went, and especially because I know exactly where you can split it, because really you can split the season almost straight down the middle, with the first half being all the caster stuff, and then the second half being, basically the split is where Archer reveals that he's really Shirou, or Shiro's future, and then so I watched all of those episodes, like the first 6 or so, that night, and then I watched the second half yesterday. I went like that whole week just feeling like I knew where the good stopping point was. Like I couldn't, after talking about Fate Stay Night for like 3 hours with you, I couldn't resist just going and watching a bunch. But then once you watch one episode, as you say, Jonathan, it's like, if nothing else, you just need to listen to Brave Shine again. Like, even if, you didn't feel like you had to go on to the next episode, you're like, well, I could just listen to Brave Shine one more time. And then all of a sudden you've watched 5 more episodes than you intended to. And that's like really the effect of the second half of this show. It's
extremely true. So it's wonderful. Where do you want to start with this season of Unlimited Blade Works?
Like one thing I want to ask, just because I'm curious, because it was something that obviously in talking about this for the last episode, there were some things I had to be very careful about how I talked about them to try to not do spoilers. And I'm curious, did you catch on? Because there is lots and lots of foreshadowing about it. Did you realize that Archer was Emiya, his future self in the last season?
I don't think I would have fully realized it from the last season. I think by the time you get to the revelation in season 2, it's very clear. I mean, they started seeding that right off the bat, and they effectively, the audience is meant to, I think, understand that by the time someone vocalizes it. But yeah, I don't know if I was like looking for that twist so much. I think there were definitely things I was picking up on that, like, there are similarities. The big foreshadowing in season 1 is that Emiya is fighting like Archer, and he is like imagining himself in his dreams and in his combat with Saber when they're training. He is like instinctively doing moves like Archer, even though he doesn't like this guy. So there's some connection there. Their character designs evoke one another in ways that become clearer the deeper into the series you get. So yeah, I don't know if I was thinking about it that way, but definitely by the time we get there, it's very obvious.
Okay, good. I'm glad that my, like, trying to be incredibly careful about not calling him Imiya, which is, like, how he's referred to in stuff like Fate Grand Order when you have 100 archers, so you can't call people Archer anymore for that game because it's too confusing. I'm glad that that paid off, that it wasn't that you had already figured it out or not, because there were a couple of moments where I was like, does Jonathan know? Because in the game, I think it's very hard to actually see it coming because you've already played a whole story, where in the Fate route, it never comes up, because it's not relevant to the Fate route. I think in the Fate route, if I remember correctly, Archer never actually recovers his memories at all, so it never becomes a plot point. And so you've already played through a whole story arc with this guy, where, like, the notion of his identity being, like, a huge plot relevant thing was never important. And so I don't think you're even really necessarily looking for a twist there. Whereas with the anime, I've always been curious, like, because they keep all the foreshadowing, of which there is a lot. Like, I mean, down to, you know, Shiro's whole thing is that he's, you know, he was in the archery club, right? And he was, like, this incredibly good archer. And then he quits one day kind of seemingly at random because of Shinji. So that's one big piece of foreshadowing. You have the thing with the pendant and how there are two pendants, which is more obvious in the anime because you can see it, whereas in the game it's less obvious. And then, as you say, there's, like, all this stuff about Shiro is starting to be able to use the same magic as Archer is using. He's, like, seemingly, like, emulating him for no particular reason. Archer has some sort of obsession with Shiro. Archer, like, knows Saber, and there's not clear, like, how or why he would know anything about Saber. So there's, like, lots and lots and lots and lots and lots of foreshadowing. If you go back and watch season 1, it is just, like, constant foreshadowing. But yeah, I think if you don't have the notion that it's even possible that could happen, because it is kind of like an insane thing, it's nice to know that that twist can still work and still have, like, the effect I think it's meant to have, even in the anime version.
And I don't know if I would even call it a twist. The way it is, like, delivered to you over, like, I think it's a series of episodes where you start to think, are they the same person? And then you kind of get, you know, piece by piece it sort of confirmed until finally Archer and Shiro are, like, staring each other down and they say that they know it, right? You know, you kind of come to know it the same way Shiro does. I do have, on the point of there being a billion archers, here's a question that I'm very curious about. In the anime, Saber always refers to Gilgamesh as Archer because that's how she knew him in Fate Zero. Is that in Fate Stay Night? Or was that a detail added for the... Okay, that's interesting.
Yeah, so in the Fate route, when you first encounter Gilgamesh, it's in a scene where Saber's there and she calls him Archer.
Okay.
And that's where you get all this backstory about how there was the previous Holy Grail War and he's a servant that has stuck around. Yeah, all of that is in the original game.
Yeah, I was very curious about that because I wasn't sure, you know, having not read the visual novel, I don't know what all Fate Zero invented and what it is just following from the game. And so, yeah, that makes sense. In this, it did kind of make me sit up because I assume in the Fate, as you just said, in the Fate route, they exposit all of that. They don't have to do that here, and they don't. It's just they move through it very quickly. Saber calls him Archer, even though he has no class in this version of the story, right? Because he is just... He's not a servant, really. He's a servant, but he stuck around. He wasn't summoned as one of the seven, right?
I mean, he physically exists in the world. Like, yeah, arguably, he's not a heroic spirit anymore because he's not actually a spirit any longer. Like, whatever happened when the Grail's contents poured on him gave him a physical body. So, like, that's also why he can't just, like, disappear and shit like that, like the other servants can.
All of that, I have to say, blows my mind watching it in this order because it's so like this Gilgamesh, he's got his, like, modern day character design, he's got the short haircut, he's got the cool black jacket, all of that. It so feels like the sequel version of Gilgamesh, like the one we met in Fate Zero. That's the original version of the character, and then this is, but that's not how it was done in the original publication order, and it does really kind of blow my mind in a cool way that, like, that's a very rich backstory that you arrived at this as the first version of Gilgamesh that people would have met in Fate Stay Night. But the opposite side of that is that it works really, really well as a sequel because even if there's stuff like you mentioned earlier that, like, Kotomine, not in this a ton despite his importance in Fate Zero, Gilgamesh is really important and it's a great payoff on what we got from him in Zero. So that works like fucking gangbusters.
Yeah, like really, they don't do anything significant in this anime to adjust it to, for those kinds of things, to adjust it to match Fate Zero. Like all those lines and scenes where Saber and Archer slash Gilgamesh are encountering each other, talking about or to each other, like that's all exactly basically how those scenes go in the game. Yeah, it's one of the things that's great about the game is that like that backstory stuff is really rich and very, very detailed, and you learn more and more about it in each subsequent route, because there's lots of like the bigger backstory about the actual Grail and where it comes from and all that kind of stuff that we still don't know yet, that maybe we'll find out about in the future. But yeah, so it's Fate Stay Night has, as a game, a really, really richly detailed backstory, which is why I think like Fate Zero was a really natural project for them to do, because you have that like clear storyline with Kiritsugu and Kotomine and Gilgamesh to do, but then you had all the rest of the Holy Grail War to flesh out. And so, yeah, it is like a really sort of, it's about like the best I've ever seen this kind of thing done in terms of prequelizing something and doing an actual prequel story based on hints and things you've seen from the original. Like, I don't think you can really do it better than Fate Zero and Fate Stay Night.
No, I mean, I was thinking about, I don't know if we talked about this. I remember like writing this in my notes, but with Fate Zero, the thing that I do think separates Fate Zero from most great prequels is that it works 100% just as the introduction. Like, with all the other of my favorite prequels, like the Star Wars prequels or Gundam The Origin or something like that, I would never tell you to start there, right? Like, that would be a bad way to watch Star Wars. That would be a really weird way to watch Gundam. You know, that is made as a prequel. Fate Zero just works as the first story. And then you get into this. So I know we're going back to Fate Zero on that, but it bears repeating. That's a great show. And this show, you know, part of why it works so well, even though they're starting on the second route of the game, is because of how it is able to also operate as a sequel to Fate Zero. And I think it does that, you know, largely very naturally, other than those couple of things like Kotomine is not big in this one. He's going to be big in Heaven's Feel, blah, blah, blah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, and it's something that's really relevant in season 2, the Fate Zero stuff, because this is where it starts really coming to the front and center, because that's part of the point of the Archer twist, right? Is that this is where you fully get now Shirou having to, and like, confront face to face the reality of like his ideals and what his ideals are, where they come from, what they can lead him to, which is all stuff we've seen Kiritsugu struggle with. But I think this really highlights that Shiro is a very different kind of person than Emiya Kiritsugu was. And he reacts to the things in his life very differently. He's not the guy who shoots the plane with the rocket launcher and then weeps afterwards. Like, there's something very disturbing about Shiro in his sort of almost machine-like process with which he's going about trying to be this like hero of justice. And that's so much of like we've had all those little bits and pieces set up in season 1 where you get that sense of there's something really unsettling about him. There's something like underneath everything that Shiro is doing that feels wrong, and Tosaka like is catching up to it and sort of putting those pieces together. She learns in the finale of season 1 that he is the more or less like the sole survivor. I don't think he's literally the sole survivor, but he's one of the only people who survived that disaster at the end of the last Holy Grail War. Thus, like, his sort of traumas run a lot deeper than I think she could have really imagined. And then now that all in season 2 comes to a head to see, and this is like one of, or maybe the only path that he can end up with, is this sort of alone life of Archer, going about constantly having to pick up after the messes that humanity makes for all of eternity, effectively, because that's what being this like sort of undying hero of justice is, that you never get to achieve that ideal, and that ideal leaves you like kind of alone and broken on a sword of hill, or like a hill of swords, right? And that's like sort of the process you see unfold over the first half of season 2 as you're wrapping up the caster stuff, is really kind of building up to these moments of realizing this is where Shiro is headed. It is to this guy.
Yeah, absolutely. It's fascinating, and I think, you know, we talked about this before at, you know, ufotable. It comes time to do an actual adaptation of the visual novel Fate Stay Night. What are you going to do with that? And from what again, I have not read the visual novel yet, though I am very excited to. But from what you've told me, it really does sound like if you know, you have already made Fate Zero, which they have, this is the actual story you should be telling as the sequel to it, it sounds like. Because it seems like the Fate route would be repeating a lot of the exposition you already know, and then, really following up on Saber. But Saber is not the center of Fate Zero. She's important to it, but she is not the center in the way Kiritsugu is. And so when you do a story that is really about, Shiro's internality and what he inherited from this man who adopted him, and how that ideal kind of follows down through him, that's the story thematically I think you really want to follow up on if you did Fate Zero. And again, it just, even if there's little things like, oh, Kotomine wasn't in this very much, he got killed. Oh, it's a very satisfying death because Lancer is awesome. I fucking love Lancer in this. But, even if there's little moments like that, overall it is such a, taking those ideas and deepening them. And I love that about it.
Yeah, absolutely. Because, this is the story that is really specifically about Shiro, right? Like, technically Tosaka is the co-lead, and she's obviously very important, but fundamentally the core relationship here is between Shiro and Archer, right? And Tosaka's relationship to Shiro is fundamentally through the lens of her having also this relationship with Archer, right? Because she has figured this out more or less. She knows probably by the end of the first season, there are multiple hints that she has figured out basically what is going on. There's conversations in that date where Shiro is sort of saying something about he feels too short. I forget how the conversation comes up, but he's like, I don't feel like I could, be a bit taller. I feel too short. And then Tosaka says oh, don't worry about it. You'll fill out better. And you'll get bigger. Trust me. All those kinds of things where she's clearly basically put it together. And she also knows about Archer's past, because she's seen his dreams, because masters can see dreams of their servants and sort of the lives that they led. So she knows all of this. And so it's her relationship with Shiro is her trying to find this way to help this boy that she has a crush on to lead a life that is rewarding for himself, because she sees that the path he's walking is one where there is no reward, where he gives other people happiness, but he never gets to be happy himself.
This is, I think, one of the most remarkable things about this story is how fucking deep and totalizing the metaphor, the symbolism, the motif of the Unlimited Blade Works runs through this story. And I have to admit, when I had heard this title obviously long ago, but when you hear the title Fate Stay Night Unlimited Blade Works, and you don't know the game or the story, I would have expected that was a gibberish English title that meant nothing, the way Attack on Titan does, frankly. Yes. It's this crazy assemblage of words, what is that going to mean? And of course, it's as far away from that as you can possibly get. It's a extraordinarily evocative idea, because all of it keeps coming back to that, the Unlimited Blade Works, which is the reality marble that is the true power of Shiro, Emiya, and Archer, is his personality and ideal made manifest. And it is one of the, it is one of the most teachable, perfect examples of symbolism in storytelling that I actually don't know if at a certain point it even is symbolism, because it is just literally this is the magical manifestation of this person's damage. But it is such an interesting thing that runs through this season, because that imagery is there in the first season. It's there in the theme songs, and it's there in several moments where we see sort of inside Archer's mind, those dreams. But then, of course, it is kind of the core setting of the second season is inside that reality marble, inside the, just wasteland of the swords. And it is such an incredible, potent piece of imagery and of writing, and it is something ufotable just absolutely runs with as an animation team of doing, what that all looks like. It's incredible. And as a piece of story, just all the ways we keep kind of circling back to the idea of what is the Unlimited Blade Works? What does it mean? What is, that line when Junichi Suabe first says it, I am the bone of my sword. That sounds cool, but it also, for all we know, could be, again, kind of gibberish, and it's not. It's that's the core of the whole idea, and I think that's so cool, and it's an extraordinarily smart piece of storytelling, as all of the Kinoko Nasu stuff we've been seeing is. But it runs so deep in this story. It's really fascinating to me.
Yeah, I think one thing I appreciate about Nasu as a writer is that he has the absolute perfect level of understanding of English. That he is far from a native English speaker, but he knows enough to be ambitious with what he does, right? So that whole "I'm the bone of my sword" poem is written by him, and we'll get into the poem stuff when we get talk more in detail about the Unlimited Blade Works episodes. But it's like, it's not gibberish English, but it's like towing the line where it's something that no native English speaker would ever write that phrase. I don't even think really it is the phrase that he means to write, I am the bone of my sword. But it works so well. And Unlimited Blade Works is exactly that. Like, you would never, no native English speaker would ever come up with that series of words, but it actually makes sense. Like, it is what it says on the box, right? It works like a factory that makes unlimited blades. And that is what Shiro's life is. That's what his inner life is. He is a man whose body is made of swords. And he's like, forever alone in this wasteland covered with like all the weapons and the swords and the things he has ever seen in his life, which are the things he can replicate and make sort of mimics of, and yeah, there is something like so powerful about that imagery and about the concept. And there's something like linguistically about the sort of almost uncanny nature of Nasu's English, where it is technically correct, like it grammatically makes sense, but it's from such a different perspective because it is not sort of conventional English, that it makes you as an English speaker have to think about what it means. And there's something I really love about that. Like, it is just that perfect level of awkwardness to the writing, that it's like it's that step or two above Attack on Titan, where Attack on Titan is just a nonsense phrase. It makes no sense. You can't really parse it grammatically. You're like, I have no idea what the fuck this means in relation to the show. Like, I can tell what you're getting at, and I could rewrite the title to make sense. But this is like, no, it actually does make sense. There's nothing actually wrong with it. And then the way it's deployed in the show thematically and visually and symbolically is fucking chef's kiss perfect.
You know what it reminds me of is actually Lotus Juice, who does all the raps for the Persona games. Lotus Juice is a guy who, born in Japan. He moved to the United States, I think, when he was like 8 or 9 and lived there until college. So he does fluently speak English, but English is his second language. And the way he uses English in his raps is amazing because no native speaker, I think, would put words together quite the way he does. But it works 100%. But I love seeing that when someone is playing with the language in a way that, if you speak the language natively, you're not going to be playful with it in that same way, right? Kinoko Nasu is not writing raps or rhymes here, but it is that, I think, same level of like, I love seeing some of these words in combination, and it's really cool. And of course, you get that here there's both a Japanese and English version of the various chants, but they're all so fucking cool.
Yeah. Yeah, they're awesome. Should we just get into it? Should we just talk about the like incantations and stuff?
Yeah, of course we should.
Yeah.
We can jump around a little bit. That's okay.
Yeah, because obviously this is all stuff that really comes up in the middle of the season, where there are 2 episodes this season called Unlimited Blade Works, which is more confusing in English than it is in Japanese, because in English it's literally 2 episodes just called Unlimited Blade Works. One has a period at the end, it's episode 8 of this season, or episode 20 overall, is Unlimited Blade Works period, and then the penultimate episode is Unlimited Blade Works without a period, but it's actually Mugen no Kensei, which is the Japanese phrase that means Unlimited Blade Works. And it's that Mugen no Kensei Unlimited Blade Works thing is exactly what I talked about in the Fate Zero episode about Excalibur and the Sword of Promised Victory. It's the same thing, where it's written with kanji, that the kanji are Mugen no Kensei, which is Mugen means infinite, Ken is sword, and then that sei means like to manufacture. So Kensei in that way is not like literally a word, those 2 kanji together, but its meaning is very clear. And then it's pronounced as Unlimited Blade Works. So if you were confused about what Unlimited Blade Works means, if you look at the kanji, it's very clear that it is a factory that makes infinite blades, would be the most direct way to translate it. But anyways, in that Unlimited Blade Works episode, that's where you get the full chants. And so there are 2 chants, and each chant has 2 different versions, an English version and a Japanese version. Archer has his own, and Shirou has his own version of it. I think what's interesting is that the English and Japanese versions are basically different. Like, you can see where there are similarities, but they mean different things. So the English language chant that Archer uses, that Junichi Suabe has by 2015 gotten very good at saying, so he sounds a lot better saying it in this anime than he does in the game, because he's had to say it a lot more, because any game which Archer appears in, he has to say this whole thing every time he uses his super move. But his chant is, I am the bone of my sword. Steel is my body and fire is my blood. I have created over 1,000 blades, unknown to death nor known to life. Have withstood pain to create many weapons, yet those hands will never hold anything. So as I pray, unlimited blade works.
It's so good.
Which is very cool. You can definitely parse together the meaning. But for me, really, I think the much more impactful one, poetically, because it makes this is more impactful, is the Japanese one, which I do. I'm just going to read it out in Japanese, and then I'll read the English translation, because I think the Japanese sounds super fucking cool for this poem. So the Japanese version of that chant, which again is going to mean something like fairly differently in the details, is Karada wa tsurugi de dekiteiru. Chishio wa tetsu de kokoro wa garas. Iku tabi no senjo o koete fuhai. Tada no ichido mo haisou wa naku. Tada no ichido mo rikai sarenai. Kare no mono wa tsune ni hitori. Tsurugi no oka de shori ni you. Yoi ni shogai ni imi wa naku. Sono karada wa kitto tsurugi de dekiteita. Which that means, I'm going to read this translation, and I'm actually going to take a little bit of a exception with how the translation translates one or two things. But the standard translation for that is, my body is made out of swords. My blood is of iron, and my heart of glass. I have overcome countless battlefields, not even once retreating, not even once being understood. He was always alone, intoxicated with victory in a hill of swords. Thus his life has no meaning. That body was certainly made of swords. Which the one thing I want to take exception with this translation is that in those first couple lines, it's in the first person. I think one thing I like about this poem, I think it's something that the English version keeps it basically always in the first person. The Japanese poem is ambiguous for the first half about who or like what the perspective is, and then in the third to last line of the poem, it says "Kare no mono wa tsune hitori," which moves it explicitly into the third person. It's his body he is alone, basically. And then the last line, "Sono kara wa kitto tsurugi de dekiteita," is specifically his body was certainly made out of swords, or that body is what the specific translation. And so there's something about the chant that I have always interpreted. If you look at the Japanese version and read that closely, that I don't think this is like something that Archer came up with himself. I read this as this is the like legend that he left behind, right? This is the man, this wanderer who has left this sort of path of destruction in his wake, but also like salvation, as this like one person who is alone, who has never retreated, who's never been understood, who is alone on this hill of swords, whose life has no meaning, and his body is made of swords. And this is like the legend of this man that has been passed down. And that's why I think it moves explicitly into this third person phrasing. Because when Shirou says this, and we'll get into his version later, Shirou's version is entirely in the first person, which is like a very like powerful difference in how it's written. But there's something about Archer's, it's so lonely, this phrasing. When it moves to "Sono kara wa kitto tsurugi de dekiteita," that body was certainly made out of swords. It is such a like dark phrase, like it feels so distant. It's not even a person, it's that body was certainly made out of swords. It's something I've always found like very powerful about the writing of this incantation, which all of this, like this Japanese version, this is the poem that is read by Rin in the first season when she sees his dream. She reads out the Japanese version. So this is what you get.
Well, and I wanted to flag that, Sean, because your whole interpretation of it's like something that someone else has said about him, that's, I don't know about in the game, but in the anime, that is how we are introduced to it. Because we've only heard the English chant up until that point, and we haven't even heard the full thing, but we have heard Junichi Suwabe say, "I am the bone of my sword," and it's amazing. Yeah. But then it's in, I think, episode 8, starts with a dream sequence where Rin recites the full Japanese chant, and I actually do think I understand the choice. I think the official subtitles on Crunchyroll just give the English, like, I think that's wrong. I wish they did because what that's saying there is that's her talking in the third person, basically, because that's how the chant works. And I think it tips the hand to say, this is what this is sort of actually doing here, right? is that it's someone speaking about the legend of this person. Whereas, and I think there's a reason why when Junichi Suwabe does it, it's usually the English first-person one until you get deeper into the story. Because I agree with your interpretation, and it's so haunting when it is Reen specifically saying it about him, and you don't know, it's early in the show, it's episode 8, where are they going to go with this? It's such a memorable sequence.
Yeah, and I think because one of the things here is this is exactly the Excalibur Sword of Promise Victory thing. Like, it's written in the Japanese version, but he reads it with the English text for Junichi Suwabe or for the Archer character. So it's like, what he is saying is, I am the bone of my sword. But what I am the bone of my sword means is my body is made out of swords, or this body is made out of swords. However you want to, again, that line written in Japanese is not, it doesn't give you context for what body is being talking about. It just says body is made out of swords would be the most literal translation of it. And so, like, it's a thing where he's saying it, like Saber says Excalibur, but in its, like, core, what Excalibur means is the sword of promised victory. Excalibur is just like this. If people know semiotics, it's like a signifier signified thing. Like, it's the sign that indicates to the reader the real significant or signified meaning, which is sword of promised victory, or the body is made out of swords. Because that's also where I think I am the bone of my sword is kind of like a classic English to Japanese mistaken phrasing, because it's like, it's really meant to be like swords are my bones. But because like the nouns are flipped in order between English and Japanese grammatically, typically you would get something like this. So, like, and I think it sounds cooler, I am the bone of my sword, even if I think technically the line is meant to be something more like swords are my bones or something to that effect. But
because the follow-up line is steel is my body and fire is my blood. Yeah. Mm-hmm. It does work in the other direction in so much as the swords are all projections of Shirou, right? And he talks about this in the final, like, confrontation with Gilgamesh, is I'm not making anything. I can only do what is in my imagination. But yes, in the larger context of the poem, it makes sense the other way around. But hey, it's so cool. It's such a good poem. We get 2 completely different versions of it.
Yeah, because let's then talk about Shirou's version, because it's really good. And Shirou, he never says the English version. Like, that's just not, like, I don't even actually know where the English language text comes from. It must be in the game. I don't remember. Because I have up here this is from the Type Moon fandom wiki, if people are curious.
I have it up here too. Okay. And it is also what they use in the subtitles on the official version, is when he says this, they give the official English translation with which ends with "My whole life was unlimited blade works," that whole thing.
Yes, and so his version, which is mostly the same in English, I am the bone of my sword, steel is my body, and fire is my blood. I have created over 1,000 blades, this is very different, unaware of loss, nor aware of gain, withstood pain to create weapons, waiting for one's arrival. I have no regrets, this is the only path, my whole life was unlimited blade works. Which is, is pretty cool. It's nowhere near as cool as the Japanese version. The Japanese version of this one is fucking, I just love it. Which is, Karada wa tsurugi de dekite iru. Chishi wa tetsu de kokoro wa garas. Iku tabi no senjou wo koete fuhai. Tada ichido no haisou mo naku. Tada ichido no shouri mo nashi. Ninaite wa koku ni hitori. Tsurugi no waka de tetsu o utsu. Naraba waga shogai ni imi wa irazu. Kono karada wa mugen no tsurugi de dekite ita. Which is, to me, it's him, he is like claiming this for himself, right? The literal translation of that poem is, my body is made of swords, my blood is of iron and my heart of glass. I have overcome countless battlefields, not even once retreating, not even once being victorious. The bearer lies here alone, forging iron in a hill of swords. Thus my life needs no meaning. This body is made of infinite swords. And that, there's something very powerful about that last line as Shirou says it, because again, it shifts it from that body, Sono Karada wa, to Kono Karada wa. This body is made of infinite swords. And there's something so powerful about Shirou. His journey, his journey in this season is represented in this poem. It's about him going from despairing over the path that his ideals are leading him to him like claiming it, understanding that it might lead him to disaster, but knowing that like it's not wrong to live your life for others. Even if there's maybe like a cleverer way for him to go about this stuff, that it's still his way of living his life. There's something so powerful about him reaffirming it and claiming the Unlimited Blade Works for himself in this show.
And I'm sure we'll get into it more later, but that penultimate episode, which is where this comes from, it's the big final fight with Gilgamesh. One of the most badass things anyone's ever done in the history of anime is this fucking 16-year-old boy who previously did not have many special powers. He could make steel objects slightly stronger, as sitting down in his basement, right? And now he is going toe-to-toe with the King of Kings, chanting this poem about how he's lost every time he's gotten in the ring, which he has so far in this season. He does not win a fight until he wins against Gilgamesh, which he really wins more in like a Pyrrhic victory sense, and then lives because the Grail consumes Gilgamesh, right?
Yeah.
And it is just one of the, and we'll talk about the animation and everything, it's incredible, but that episode has several stand-up and cheer moments, and I think Shirou doing the chant and getting to those final lines, Jesus Christ, it's amazing.
Yeah, there's just something about I think the elegance of the writing of those poems, particularly in Japanese, that how much meaning I think there is in moving a couple of lines from being explicitly third person to explicitly first person there is it's so powerful. But there's also something, talking about like the symbolism of all this, that first line, which my body's made of swords, kata wa tsurugi de dekiteiru. That's like the hallmark line of it, right? It's the equivalent of I am the bone of my sword. Only it's much easier to tell what my body's made of swords means than I'm the bone of my sword. But that notion, right, it's a very defining idea for Shirou's life, right? He is a man whose body is made of swords. And there's a lot that I think is packed into that meaning. And one of it is that it is part of the wall that he puts up between himself and everybody else, right? That anybody who gets too close to him gets cut because his body is made of swords. He's made of iron, although his heart is made of glass, so his heart is very fragile. But nobody can get at that heart because his body is made of swords. But I think there's something about, for Unlimited Blade Works, it turns that on its head a little bit and also finds strength in it, right? That there is, there's a lonely quality to being a man whose body is made of swords, but there's always also a strength there that you can fight for what you believe in or what you need, the change you need to make in the world. And that's possible because your body is made of swords. And it's to use a very painful metaphor, it's a double-edged sword is the life that he leads, right? It is a thing that he can cut other people with, he can cut himself with. But it is the only thing he knows how to do, as he describes it. It's the only magic or ability allowed for Inuyashiro is to make this inner world project it out into the world. All of his magic and everything he does is just an extension of his ability to take this battlefield of an infinite number of swords and put that out into the world, because that's what's in his heart.
And when I talk about feeling uneasy with elements of the ending, I'm not just talking about the epilogue. I think it's consistent throughout the second half of this show, where there is this, basically the last 6 or 7 episodes is this series of encounters, starting with his duel with Archer, the episode called Unlimited Blade Works English, and then the episode called Answer. Both of those are just given in English, where he has the big duel with Archer, and not just a duel, but, an actual, intellectual character confrontation. And it kind of keeps coming back to, it's the even so phrase, the sore demo, that kind of thing. Mm-hmm. It's the same phrasing that is used in Unicorn Gundam, for instance, right? That Banaji keeps saying of even so, we're going to go with this. And it's interesting because you do get a full-throated response from Shirou to Archer that Archer is moved by. Archer changes his kind of outlook a little bit, and he winds up seemingly sacrificing his life and telling Shirou, hey, you're the only one who can defeat Gilgamesh, right? And then you have another confrontation with Shirou, sort of, between him and his other friends, and then finally you have it in his confrontation with Gilgamesh, and then you have the epilogue where we kind of get it pushed one more time. So it's this series of, I have seen the future is almost indescribably bleak in the way Archer presents it, right? And it's part of why Archer doesn't claim the first person the same way, right? Mm-hmm. Because he hates it, he resents it. And we'll talk about that in a moment here, because I want to get into just what a bleak portrait they paint of that. But you have that, and then you have Shirou being confronted with that. And I think for most people, certainly for me confronting this, I think you expect that the ending or the resolution or the rejoinder from Shirou is going to be no, my life doesn't have to turn out like yours. I can make different choices, etc. The Christmas Carol thing. I'm joking about Ghost of Christmas Future, but it is kind of that idea. It is, with Christmas Carol being like one of the original time travel stories, right? It is like it is a time travel narrative of seeing your future and being confronted with that, and those stories usually end with the protagonist making a change. To some degree, Shirou does, because Shirou is in a much healthier place at the end of Unlimited Blade Works than I think Archer ever was, because he's opened himself up to Rin and other people to a certain extent. But it is still ultimately him looking at Archer and saying, even so, I still believe in this. There's no amount of bleakness you can give me, Archer, that makes me, like, that shakes this out of me, because it is who I am. That's what those poems are about. That when you say my body is made of swords, it's like, this is something that is unshakable from me, and it comes from that original foundational trauma of the fire, of literally being like born in the flames of hell. There's an entire sequence that basically frames it through that prism of Archer like showing him, again in a very Christmas Carol fashion, like, here is the ghost of your Christmas past, Shirou, and like, this is hell. And Shirou seeing that, and what did Kiritsugu's kindness and just joy in saving Shirou there, what did that actually mean to him? Why has he embraced this ideal, even if it was not originally his? And it keeps coming back to this, I can't actually shift it. And it's instead of taking like, I'm going to go a different direction than you, Archer, it's kind of almost I'm going to double the fuck down on this. And I think that is what is so confrontational and interesting about it, in that it forces you to see, as it forces Archer, to see the like actual value in this very beautiful ideal that Shirou has, and the also like very real like interpersonal danger to it. And I think that's what makes it so provocative, and makes the last half of this show and this season like really unsettled in fascinating ways, where I just was never quite sure where the thematic die was going to fall, because it was so breaking, I think, the rules of fiction like this, for me at least.
Yeah, and I think like really where a lot of this stuff starts coming into much clearer focus in this season is actually a little bit before this stuff, because I think it's one of for me the best scenes and like the best episodes of the show is the episode where all the Ilias stuff happens, right? And there's that moment where Shirou and Rin are like up in the balcony looking like they've snuck in. They're looking down. The fight between Berserker and Gilgamesh is basically over. And Gilgamesh cuts Ilia's eyes because he's going to go rip her heart out because he wants the grail. And they have just, like, the last time you saw Rin and Shirou, Rin was telling him, like, do not fucking do anything because you are powerless. Neither of them have servants at this point. There is nothing they can fucking do. It's just like, whatever you do, do nothing. And as soon as Shirou sees that happen, like, Rin has to physically tackle him to the ground, hold him down, and muffle him as he's like screaming and his eyes are bugging out to try to keep him from interfering. And then even that ultimately doesn't work because eventually he breaks free and still tries to have a fight with Gilgamesh, which is insane. You know, there's absolutely nothing that Shirou could do. He doesn't know how to use fucking Unlimited Blade Works or jack shit. Like, the most he could do is make a couple of knives with his magic power, and that's like as far as he could go. He doesn't know anything about how his healing shit has been working, but his healing shit wouldn't be working. So if Gilgamesh had wanted to, he would have been dead in literally a blink of an eye. And so after that point, they bury Ilia, and at the grave, there's this conversation between Rin and Shirou that's incredibly upsetting, where, like, Shirou is just fundamentally doesn't understand, like, what Rin is really trying to tell him about, like, how empty and hollow he is, and how there's something about the way that Shirou seems to place no value whatsoever on his own life in this very unthinking robotic fashion, where, like, when you weigh things on the scales of you're trying to choose something for anybody, your own ability to survive would be a thing that weighs really fucking heavily on your scales if you're trying to make a choice. And then it would have to be, you'd have to be able to really do something incredible to balance that out. It's like, oh, if I could save this entire group of people, maybe I'd be willing to give up my life. That would be a thing that you could understand. But it's like, you're not going to be able to save anybody. It's already fucking over. Ilia's dead. And yet you're still willing to just throw your life away for what is literally nothing. And Shiro just seems unable to grasp any of this. And like, I think that's where Tosaka fully understands that, like, for Shiro, the concept of like happiness and his own personal satisfaction and things like that have no meaning. That he's like so far gone from that point. He's so ripped up with his like survivor's guilt. He's so twisted around his own idealism. And that's what she literally describes the way he lives his life. Is she uses the word ibitsu. It's like it's a twisted or like way of living your life. And there's like there's seemingly no way that he can change. And like Tosaka, her whole mission is try to find some way to get him to be able to love himself. And with this show, it's like an open question of will he ever be able to get to that point? But I think that for me, that whole sequence, which is a really fantastic adaptation and condensation of some different scenes from the game, really like brings home and shoves you face to face with like just how fucked up Shiro really is. Like it goes, I think, a lot deeper than you would think up to that point.
Oh yeah, because you go from he is like pathologically unable to say no to people at the beginning of the show. He's fixing everyone's equipment. He's doing stuff for Shinji, even though he knows Shinji is bullying him and bullying everyone because Shinji's a piece of shit. All of that. But that's not the worst thing in the world. That's being a high schooler who's not standing up for yourself. To exactly as you say here, it's like it's suicidal, effectively, when you are running at Gilgamesh after seeing him tear apart Berserker, who... This is another thing just to say, like, I think the beginning of Season 2 really unsettles expectations in so much as Unlimited Blade Works starts, and maybe this is different if you've seen, like, the Fate route, but for me, this was my introduction to all of these versions of the servants, right? And Unlimited Blade Works, the first servant they encounter is Berserker, who seems impossible to defeat, right? Like, Saber does Saber rips this guy apart and then he just heals, right? And it's like, oh god, what are we... That's a, like, open question throughout Season 1 is they keep, like, mentioning Berserker and being like, we'll figure that out later. That seems like an impossible task. Caster seems like an impossible task, all of that stuff. And, of course, they don't wind up having to deal with Berserker because Gilgamesh doesn't even lift a finger, does nothing to like destroy. He doesn't get out Ea. He doesn't have to do anything really other than stand there and let some of his swords come out, right? And just tears this thing apart. And that is the moment when Shiro is like, I'm gonna go fight that guy. That's suicidal, right? Like that is effectively wishing for death. And you're right, it is twisted. And I want to highlight here in these two episodes, as this is episodes 3 and 4 you're talking about, Kana Ueda is phenomenal in those episodes as Tosaka Rin. The scene that you were describing earlier where she is literally having to like physically restrain Shiro. This is when Gilgamesh is killing Ilya and she's like holding him down, wrestling him to the ground, and he is screaming and she is just like begging him like, no, don't. There is like a panic in her voice that is like visceral and uncomfortable and you just feel it. And then the flip side of like the anger and confusion she has towards him in the subsequent episode when they're at the grave, it's the same thing where it's like it's a performance that just feels so raw and real. It's like she's in the room with you. It's like overall I would say in the last maybe 6 or 7 episodes she fades into the background a little bit, not the performance but the character, although she has a phenomenal moment with Archer in the penultimate episode that is also just peak Kana Ueda. But I think in these two that's just like, oh my god, what a performance. This is incredible.
Yeah, and then it's something also, like, if you know, like, what you now know, Jonathan, of, like, that she has actually, like, had a crush, effectively, on Shiro the whole time. Like, she has this memory of seeing him try over and over, like an idiot, to do this, like, high jump or whatever, and it's, like, a kind of a very cherished memory of Tosaka, of her in middle school watching this boy do this, and that's actually where she knows him from. It's not the Sakura stuff, but some of that is more explained more directly in the game, because you see that whole scene from her eyes. If you see that whole scene from her eyes through the eyes of Shiro, who's experiencing it because he's having her dream because they're connected magically. But anyways, like, but that's where you realize like some of like what Tosaka's doing there is like she has like she has such a powerful bond with Shiro to a point that like Shiro doesn't really know yet at this point. That he means a lot to her. And so, yes, there's something I think like Ueda kind of gets so much of that desperation where like Tosaka's how ripped up she is inside at seeing this boy who she knows to be like very noble and very compassionate and like stubborn, and has all these like, but stubborn in this way of like, he's never going to give up to try to help people. And they're all things that she admires in him, because it's all kind of the stuff that she wants to be able to do that sometimes she suppresses because she needs to be a mage or whatever. And, you know, being a mage means being a fucking bastard, you know, is everything that we have seen in this world. And so seeing him so cavalierly jumping into his own death over and over and over and over again. But in some of the other scenarios, there were like things you could do to explain it, of like, oh, you know, he never really considered the idea that Tosaka would kill him, which she was never going to kill him. You know, but like, that's why he shows up to school like an idiot in the first season. Or, you know, yeah, he goes and runs off to fight Ryder or whatever. But that's like a very desperate situation and they don't know what's going on yet. So it's not clear how dangerous it is. Like this is, you know, 100% there's nothing you can fucking do, and yet you're still trying to jump down there. Like there is no excuse at that point that Shirou can lean on. And, you know, she is able to kind of bring him back a little bit from like the mania he sort of expresses at Ilya's grave, where he's like, seems just completely broken. But she's never, but like Shiro's response to people when they kind of bring him back a little bit to himself is always something like, he says, "You're probably right about that." It's like he intellectually understands that the way he lives his life is wrong. I think that he intellectually isn't trying to kill himself. I think if you asked him intellectually, he would understand that him dying would be pointless and it would cause other people to suffer, and he hates it. But like deep down inside in his like emotional core, he just places no value on his own life at all. And so it's like when he is emotionally pushed in any way, that's a thing that doesn't factor in for him, which is bad. It's like, and it's a thing that I think makes Shirou a really interesting character, is it takes a thing, an idea like the virtues of like bravery and self-sacrifice and stuff that we take for granted in these kinds of stories, and pushes it to this really extreme place that really makes you, I can think, second guess and question, like how much of that is a virtue and how much of that is a byproduct of some like deeper trauma or some like bigger mistake. This idea that you should be so willing to sacrifice yourself, either in like very dramatic ways, like literally sacrificing your own life, or for us in our real lives in more mundane ways where you give up as like a teacher. It's a thing you have to think about all the time, is like how much of your life are you willing to give up to this thing, and how much is that like kind of eating away at you. And Shirou is this kind of fascinating character by which you see what that mindset is when it goes to its most kind of horrifying extremes. Yeah,
it's, you know, as obviously crazy as this show gets, and it is, you know, dealing with insane magic that the mind can barely comprehend, I do think what it's describing in the pathology of Shirou is a very real phenomenon, right? Mm-hmm. You know, it is a phenomenon around guilt and around trauma and around all sorts of things. It reminded me, there's this moment in like my own kind of mental health therapy journey I had in the last year or two that like I think about every day because it blew my mind. I was reading this book by a mental health professional who I follow online, and it had this piece of advice about like adult romantic relationships, like, you know, committed, like, you know, long-term marriage partnerships. Like, it was a piece of like, not advice, but like a therapist like giving their opinion on like, what does it actually like take to like actually engage with another person on that level? One thing she said is you kind of have to answer two questions for yourself. Do you think other people are worth more than you? And do you think other people's feelings are worth more than yours, are more important than yours? And I went, well, yeah, of course they are. Yes to both. And then on the next page it said, if you said yes to both, you're wrong, and here's why. And I went, oh no. And I had like a moment, and I like, in my next like session with my my therapist who I meet with every couple weeks, I was talking about this, and like, that blew my mind. I just had never thought about it that way. That's like, I legitimately had like kind of gone through life thinking that, and I'm not saying I am like Shirou Emiya, and that soon I will summon the unlimited blade works. But it was like a significant like, oh, that's actually, that kind of messed with me to see that idea kind of put forth. You know, it all kind of goes back to I'm going to use an airplane metaphor because I was on 2 flights in the last 24 hours, of like you can't put on someone else's oxygen mask until you put on yours. That's what they always tell you. And it's a very practical piece of advice, because if you try to put on your child's oxygen mask and you asphyxiate, you're both dead, right?
Yeah.
And so it's a very practical thing to think about. And of course, if you do not have any stability in your own emotions and your own feelings, you can't do jack shit for anyone else. But I think that failure that Shirou has, even though, again, it's very intellectually easy to understand, right? That if you explain it that way, if you use the oxygen mask metaphor, it is unimpeachable logic, right? Like it just makes, it is like 2 + 2 = 4. It's very clear. But in your gut, there's still something that's like, yeah, but I want to put the oxygen mask on my kid first, right? I want to believe that this other person's feelings are more important than mine. Because sometimes it's hard to actually do that inside yourself, right? And I think that's the difficulty, and it's the very understandable on a certain level. That's the thing about Shirou, is that I think, Nasu in this whole fiction created a scenario by which it's not hard to understand why Shirou is the way he is. It actually does make sense, especially when you have Fate Zero fleshing that whole backstory out for us, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this is all stuff of like fundamentally, this is all the stuff that like really has like made me a really big fan of this story, because this whole storyline with Shirou, I think he is like a really relatable character. Obviously, he takes it to this big extreme that's like much bigger than almost anybody will have lived. Obviously, there are people who have like really powerfully tragic and traumatic histories and stuff. But for most people, it's much more mundane than that. But I think it is a really relatable thing, and it is, when I originally played the game, like it made me think about myself a lot. And it's a thing, like, again, as a teacher, like I think about all the time with myself, with other teachers, because I think it's a very common mindset of that, like all these other things are so much more important than you. And then at a certain point, I think it can become kind of pathological, where you so diminish your own significance that it clearly becomes hypocritical, because it's like, if you're like valuing people's happiness and their comfort and their ability to live their lives and stuff like that, well, you're just taking that away from yourself at a certain point to try to do that so much for other people. And it's like, what are you doing in sort of like the moral or ethical scales of the world? And what is there for like yourself if you're giving so much away to these bigger things, especially when those bigger things will never be solved, because they're not the kinds, like with Shirou's thing, being like one high school teacher, you cannot solve all the evils of the world that your students live through or that the education system has and shit like that. Like, it's just way bigger than any individual could deal with. And so, yeah, like I think all of Shirou's stuff in this show is incredibly relatable and has always made me like, is stuff that I struggle with all the time. Because I think one other part of it is also, there's a specific edge of it that is like particularly masculine, where I think there's like a kind of like masculine pathology of like self-sacrifice in a like literally like you give your life for somebody else, like you lose your life, right? As in like, oh, if like an emergency were to happen, would I be willing to trade my survival for the survival of this person or these two people? Or like, how many would it take, right? And I think like there is a way in which you're socialized, particularly if you're a man, where it's like you're meant to so devalue your own life and be like, if there is somebody else, then it's so gendered, where obviously it's like, if it's a woman, even if you understand like how like those would be very sexist assumptions, still you're so socialized to believe it that it's like, well, of course, if it was a female, then I would prioritize their survival over my own. And I think like that's like such an instinctual, in your gut, it is pounded into you for your whole life, that's one of the things I also think about a lot with Shirou, is that like how much of that is like actually noble and how much of that is actually really fucked up.
It's like the maritime tradition of women and children first, right?
Yes.
Like on the Titan, which was not actually followed that frequently on maritime law. We know about it because of the Titanic, which is a notable case where it was followed very strictly. And so the majority of casualties on the Titanic were men. A lot of women, obviously, and children died too, because most people didn't survive. But yeah, that's the kind of... And of course, this is playing with the militaristic side of that, right?
Yes.
I mean, I think one of the provocative... And I want to get into this. Let's talk about the dark version of this, the Archer, because Archer is effectively suicidal. He wants to kill Shirou because he wants to kill himself, and this is the only way he can do it. It is not in the first season, you might think this is some kind of like interpersonal, these two personalities just don't mix. It's self-hatred made extremely literal, right? It is again, this whole story is like a very psychological internal story that through the fantasy elements is made manifest and made literal. Mm-hmm. But Archer's whole thing is that he becomes a hero. He does in life do the thing. He becomes a hero of just Seigi no Mikata, which I was alternating between two different copies of this I had. One that said hero of justice and one that said champion of justice. It's bothering me. The champion of justice one, really stupid. But anyway, we talked about that before. Maybe you can expand on that later if you want. It literally means like champion of justice, but that doesn't really get the meaning across.
Yeah,
but anyway.
Ally of justice would be the very literal translation, but it's like that's so awkward, and what it means is like hero or superhero. Like a Power Ranger is a Seigi no Mikata, that kind of thing. Yeah,
Shirou wants to be. It's a term no adult would use, right? Like it's a term, like if you were a lawyer and walked into the courtroom and said, "Judge, I am the Seigi no Mikata," they'd be like, "Get the fuck out of here! Get to the defense place. Just you do your job, idiot!" Right? I mean, and there's a literal moment of that in the epilogue when Shirou meets Waver Velvet, now Lord El Meloy II, who is like, "That is a really stupid dream," but. And then I love that moment because Waver also has enough backstory to like understand where he's coming from. But anyway, we'll get to that. But he does become, as much as he can, this hero of justice. But we see in the little glimpses of like what that meant. It meant like military might. Like there's the scene where he like makes the pact with the counterforce, with the universe. Is like he's in like military garb and he's got a gun and all this stuff, right? When we see him, and then of course what happens is he makes this pact that his life winds up being failed because he is betrayed and winds up being hung and like executed for someone else's crime. It's incredibly dark imagery and like idea. But then he has made this pact with the counterforce and he becomes basically an agent of it to keep coming in and like putting humanity back on the correct path by killing the people who need to be killed. And so he does become a hero of justice, but exclusively through violence, which is kind of like Emiya Kiritsugu to the nth degree, right? It's that same idea that we kind of come back to again. And so it is like kind of that, violent, we consider it noble masculinity, but it's really violent masculinity made manifest to the nth degree as like this cosmic power that he becomes. And it is really like dark and disturbing. Like I think when you see Archer's whole story and why he has this need to just like, I want to erase my entire life. This was all a mistake. You understand it. You understand how like that can spin out into the most disturbing version of this.
Yeah, no, it's super fucked up. There's a lot of like details there that I think are very smart in terms of Shirou being depicted like a soldier. Like, I don't think you're meant to understand that he has, like, literally joined an army of a country, but he sort of styles himself as a soldier, which to me is, like, the main thing conceptually that separates him from Kiritsugu, who is, like, Kiritsugu was an assassin or an operative, Shirou is a soldier. Like, that's so his personality. That is, like, who he is. And it's, like, he's just a soldier that doesn't have a general that's commanding him. He's just a soldier who's following some sort of ideal, and that's the thing that's supposed to be pushing him on and driving him forward. And then eventually what that path leads him to is that he becomes a soldier of the world. He gives himself up to these kinds of cosmic forces, and as you said, Jonathan, he is sent he calls himself a cleaner, effectively. He is sent to any instance in human history where the scales are being tipped too far to one side or the other, where the proper course of human history is being messed with. And then he goes and he deals with that situation, which mostly involves killing people. And one thing that they, you don't see it so much, but they say is like, and, sometimes those people are bad, and sometimes maybe they weren't bad, because being good or evil on that sort of scale is kind of irrelevant. Like, you need to, like, put back, like, the history back on its proper course. You're not only killing, like, quote unquote the bad guys. And they even show some shots where, like, he's killed some child soldiers and stuff, because that's what it is to be this cleaner for the counterforce, is he's not really fighting for something that is good. He is fighting for, like, stability He's like an agent of the status quo, very literally. And that's where his ideals lead him. Like, he fails to sort of escape that and work for some sort of higher good, which I think is what Shirou ultimately wants, but he can't find a way to do it, which I think is, again, one of the things about his path that's so relatable, because I think that's what everybody's trying to do. We all are trying or want to find some way to serve a higher purpose, whether you phrase that literally in a religious sense or just like moralistically, you're trying to do something good in the world. And yet, again, I have to think about this through the lens of a teacher, you're constantly actually just reinforcing a lot of the same injustices and inequalities that exist in the status quo that you are a part of. And it's like, like there's not really much I can do to stop the like school to prison pipeline. I just get to stare it in the face every single day because of the job I work at, right? And that's the life that's the place that Shirou ends up at if he becomes Archer, is to do that for eternity, where he is literally put outside the concept of time. If he had succeeded in killing Shirou, it would have changed nothing. It's the thing that Saber points out, and Archer's like, well, it technically might happen. It wouldn't fucking happen. Like, Archer exists like outside the concept of like a single timeline. Even he is like a conceptual being at this point. So yeah, like him, if he had killed Shirou, there's probably a timeline where Archer did kill Shirou, and it wouldn't have fucking changed the goddamn thing. He is doomed to walk this path for literally all of eternity.
Yes. And of course, this is what makes the final half of this show, like I was saying earlier, so dynamic, is you are presented with this just almost impossibly bleak, kind of following the logic out to its nth degree version of this ideal. And then, Shirou is confronted with that. Shirou totally understands it intellectually and emotionally, I think. And then it is, well, what is the answer to that? Is the answer to say, then I abandon my ideal? Well, that's maybe even worse. And that's even, I think, the conclusion Archer comes to in the end of the series, right? And so then it becomes, well, what do we do with that? And I think that is where the final couple of episodes feel so dynamic and also kind of like thematically provocative and unresolved, because I don't think there is a single good response to that question once you've raised it. And I think the show is, and Kinoko Nasu is smart to not try to like give you a pat anime answer of like, if I just believe in friendship hard enough, it'll be okay. Archer, you didn't have enough friends. I will have more friends. I feel like that's the common, like we've, one of our favorite games of all time is Persona 4. Persona 4, the ending is the weakest probably part of that game because it broaches a question that is similarly big to this. And its answer really is basically the friendship is magic answer. And it isn't satisfying to the level of like philosophical intrigue raised. And I think this is in part because I don't think we come down on one single easy response. Maybe Shirou's path will be more positive than Archer. That is a possibility. Maybe it will be exactly as dark and terrible, and maybe he's made peace with that, and that's the only thing he can do, but maybe there's something else that we haven't seen in this version of the story. Does that feel like a good summary of sort of like what we do in the final half here, Sean?
Yeah, and then I think I want to just zoom in on the moment in the first Unlimited Blade Works episode of the encounter with Archer. There's and you took some screenshots of this.
I do. I have it all
that I pulled up as well. Where you have the big standout sequence that's very iconic. There's like a bunch of lines from this that get quoted all the time, particularly the Japanese community. This is when Last Stardust starts playing. Like Shirou he was cowed a little bit, and then this is him sort of like bringing himself back together. And at the end of the whole sequence is when he says like, it was my mind that was broken, or like my resolve that was broken, not my body. And this is when he pushes things back. This is where one of the lines that gets quoted all the time by the Japanese community. This is if you follow any streamers like VTubers and stuff, you will see this in the Japanese chat constantly. Because it's just a very popular line, is Sonosaki wa Jikoku dazo, which is that's hell you're walking into. There's lots of ways you can translate it. Like it literally means like it's hell past that point, or like beyond there, it's hell. In like Japanese internet like language is often used if you're watching like a streamer playing, say, like Dark Souls or something, and they're about to go fight Ornstein and Smog. You maybe would like spam that in the chat. It's like Sorosaki wa Jikoku dazo. Like it's hell past there. But anyways, but in the show you have this sequence where it's first Shiro says it to his younger self who's walking into the fire, because one of the things with Shiro is it's not just the trauma of like him being in the fire, it's also the trauma of him walking past all these people and not being able to save them. It's the thing he says all the time. It's like he has the survivor's guilt of that, like he couldn't save those people. And so he says that to that kid version of himself that goes walking into the fire. And then it does the same sequence, and now it's Archer saying it to Shiro. It's hell past there. That's when Shiro responds with, "This is what you forgot. I admit that at first it was just admiration, but the heart of it all was a wish. The wish for this hell to be undone, the unfulfilled wish of a man who only wanted to help others, but who lost everything in the end." And this is where you then get the reveal that Avalon, the scabbard of Excalibur, is embedded into Shiro's body, the same way it was with Iris Feel. And that is how Kiritsugu managed to miraculously save Shiro's life, is he put that scabbard in him. It is also why he was able to summon Saber, is he himself was the catalyst, because the catalyst was in his body the whole time. And obviously it's the reason why when he gets fucked up by Berserk or whatever, he's able to heal and everything. And that revelation in that moment, and like the music and the way they show it, is so powerful, and is one of those pieces of symbolism I think is so potent to me. The idea of that Shiro's, because it ties into everything, right? His body is made of swords. His whole life is swords. It's what his ability is. But his dream is to be a scabbard. His dream is to be a sheath. That's what the wish is to be Avalon. And it's probably not a thing he could ever actually be able to do. It's out of the reach of any individual person, but that's still the thing to be strived for. And like, that is the thing that gives it meaning, right? It's that hope. It's that one wish. And I think like the answer that Unlimited Blade Works has for like, why is Shiro still going to walk this path? Why can't he walk away from it? Is this thing of like, the ideal is meaningful in and of itself, you know, even if it means he ends up at this horrible place in that horrible life. Like, the ideal is still one worth striving for, because as he says multiple times, it's beautiful. And that makes it worthwhile. And I think it's the thing that is hard to argue with Shiro, is that, you know, maybe he is like fake, you know, all of these things and his experiences, like his dream of being a hero of justice, are all like inherited. It's not something that like is inherent to him. It's not something that he has come up with. It's all him trying to emulate what he saw in Kiritsugu. And it's also something that can't actually ever be accomplished really, but still it is valuable to pursue it, and that it's not wrong to do so. And I think there's something really powerful in that, like, this is what it does for Archer. It reminds you of yourself, right? It reminds you of like, right, like that, those more childish notions are still important. You can't let go of all of that, or you lose the will to fight. It's kind of like, you know, don't let the perfect become the enemy of the good, right? Just because you can't achieve the ideal doesn't mean it's not worth fighting to strive for it, even if it's never going to get you really the thing that you ultimately wanted.
Yeah, it's because his foundational primal memory is Kiritsugu rescuing him. But as Shiro tells us, we get our first kind of version of this in season 1. We get more of it here. It's not just that, hey, this man rescued and then adopted me. It's, I saw in his face this unbelievable joy and satisfaction. This like almost religious ecstasy of he was able to save someone. And that is what he latched onto, was like, can I achieve that? Can I achieve that feeling of, in saving this person, I have like truly like saved the world, saved myself, right? And this scene just did so much for me, because obviously there is the revelation about Avalon being, and the way they visualize it in the anime is like it's the heart of his magical circuits. It's like we follow down the circuits in his body, and Avalon is like at the center of that. So it is literally his heart, effectively. And obviously that provides a good plot explanation, because I had been wondering throughout season 1, how exactly did he... My first assumption was that, like, Kiritsugu had left Avalon in a box down there, and we were going to see that eventually, but that would feel like Kiritsugu hadn't planned very well if he just left Avalon in one of those boxes. But he did not. So, like, how did he summon Saber? And, of course, how does he keep surviving? Because I don't think we went through them all, but he suffers a crazy number of mortal blows in the first, like, 12 episodes of Unlimited Blade Works. Shirou just keeps getting cut up, and he keeps almost dying and then kind of miraculously healing to a degree that even, like, Tosaka is like, man, you're healing really fast, right? So you have all of that, and it kind of fills in that, and it's a very nice plot explanation. But it's an even better thematic explanation of Kiritsugu didn't just find this kid in the fire and pick him up. He found this dying kid in the fire, and he used the only tool he had left, which at the end of that, violent, wrenching journey in Fate Zero, the only thing he had left. He had no guns, he had no swords, he had this tool of healing, basically. And he was able to use that, and being able to use that redeemed his entire life in that moment. And that is the joy that Shirou sees and Shirou inherits, and that is why, that, more than anything, is why he can never just give up on this dream, because he knows it's real. He doesn't think it's real. He saw it. It's why he exists. It's why he is alive. It's why he's breathing, right? Because he knows there is something true to this. And so when he says it's beautiful, it's not a platitude. It really is true to him. And it is something that Archer has forgotten. But I think when Archer sees it, Archer is almost fighting himself, but he realizes it's true. Because Archer's like, I see now, the scabbard is our heart. That's the first time he, like, refers to him in the Shirou with, like, a pronoun like ours. And it's so striking. It's such a beautiful plot turn.
Yeah, because this is also where you get another line that is very well known, although it gets kind of memed on in the English community because I think it's kind of hard to translate it in an elegant way. This is also where, in this argument, he says to Archer, "Omae no tadashisa wa tadashi dake no mono da, ore wa sonna mono wa iranai," which means like the fact that it usually gets translated as something like the fact that you're correct doesn't mean that you're right. Something like that, right? That is like, while Archer's logic is technically accurate, it's like, that's all it is. It's not true with, like, a capital T. Like, what Shirou is striving for isn't a sort of, like, the correct way to live life. He's trying to find, like, the right way to live a life. A way to live, like, a life that's bigger than himself. And Archer is trying to sort of stamp that down with all the regrets that he has, I was watching this, like I said, with two different sets of subtitles. There's the official Crunchyroll subtitles, and then I also had some fan subs that I had on my iPad. And I will say, this is one instance where I actually think the fan subs did it better, because the official translation is that line of, just because you're correct doesn't mean you're right. And in the fan subs, they wrote, being right isn't everything. And I actually think that's a better... I don't know if it's not a more accurate translation strictly, but I do think it gets the idea across in English maybe a little more clearly of saying, like, just because you logically intuited, like, this is correct doesn't mean that is everything, which is what you're kind of explaining here, Sean. Yeah. It's definitely one where I think that is, like, the much more naturalistic English language version to use, because, in Japanese, like, it's a thorny line in Japanese anyways, because it's like, it makes you sort of, like, take a step back and think about it. But also, I think there's something about the way you can so easily transform adjectives into nouns grammatically in Japanese that makes that line work, that when you try to keep that in English, I've seen a bunch of translations that typically, if you're trying to preserve that, it just makes the line feel very weird. But yes, it's like this whole debate, that Shirou is having with himself, Archer, it is very much like the core of what this whole story of Unlimited Blade Works is about, right? There's something about it, I think, particularly now that I've, like, encountered it multiple times now over, like, basically a 10-year, about a 10-year period of my life at this point. Like, that, I think for me, I start to see, like, different sides of it, where it's like, as you get older, it's a little bit easier to fully be with, like, Archer here, because you've lived longer and you've seen more of, like, that like, bright-eyed, childish optimism or whatever is not always going to bring about the conclusions that you want or that you think you should get. But there is, like, Archer has an incredible line. I don't know if it's in your screenshots or not, but where he says something like, how cruel all of this is, to be like, it's like looking into an old mirror. Oh, there was someone like this once. There was a boy like this once. It's one of my favorite lines from the series. And I think it's a line that like hits me very differently now than it did when I originally played the game. This idea of looking at a mirror at your own younger self and seeing that there maybe is something right about that much more childish outlook you used to have.
Yeah. And this is also where we, Shirou in his dialogue directly brings into the text the entire, idea of the literalization of fighting against yourself, of realizing like, I can't allow myself to be beaten by you, because if I allow myself to be beaten by you, I am beaten by everyone, because you are me, right? Mm-hmm. And so this is an opposite self he has to fight in the same way that Archer kind of has to fight him, right? If you saw yourself at a younger age, I don't care if you're a heroic spirit or not, you might want to kill yourself.
Yes. Oh my God. Yeah. I would not want to be stuck in a room with teenage Sean Chapman. It's like one of us would be dead within 5 minutes.
I also just want to say about this entire scene, this is where you get the Ame song Last Stardust. And this is a scene I definitely had to watch multiple times. I first watched it on Crunchyroll. This is the thing that disappoints me most about Crunchyroll is most of the time their subtitles don't have anything for songs, which disappoints me. And so I went and watched the whole second half of this episode again on my fan subs, which did have subtitles for the song. Songs are one of the harder things like for me to understand in Japanese because you elongate the vowels and all that. Mm-hmm. So anyway, just watched it over again, focusing on the song, and the scene became even richer for me. It's such a good use of an insert song, and those lyrics are such a perfect complement to what is going on in the scene. As the scene begins, it's the lyrics. This is the translation. Suddenly, I reached the end of my dream, where I picked up the pieces of my faded memories. Love, tenderness, I thought I'd thrown it all away. But if I can find what I've lost on the way, then even if I'm destined to be wounded, my heart still harbors hope. Dance, my last stardust, dust to dust, ash to ash. May my broken wish shine eternal. That's like the first verse and chorus. And then you get another verse later on in the scene. But like, just, again, such a beautiful version of a use of an insert song where I think you can watch the scene once, just focusing on the dialogue, and watch the scene again, focusing on what Ame is singing over it. And I think you get another perspective on the scene that just enriches it all. And that, to me, is kind of the ideal of there's, insert songs can be just really fucking cool, and you get just a really great scene where, like, it's very synesthetic. And then there's that plus you focus on what the singer is saying, and it's like, oh, this is enriching this scene for me. And to me, this gets like all of it. It's
just, that whole episode is just one of the best episodes of anime ever. It's just every it's one of those where like they skip the opening theme, which is a shame because Brave Shine's so good, but you get that like immediately, oh shit, with that episode, because you get like a little opening and then it like just the opening title pops up. Fate Stay Night Unlimited Blade Works with like a boom sound, and you're like, oh shit, okay, we're like, this is going to be a very special episode of Unlimited Blade Works. You can tell right away.
Yeah. Okay, and you know what? I do have to read the second verse here, because this is when Shirou is saying, I can't be defeated by myself, or I can't be beaten by you. It's, even if I'm destined to be wounded, my heart still harbors hope. Goodbye, Judas. Sayonara, Judas. That's a great lyric. And turn to dust to dust, like my past weakness. My heart is made of cracked glass, but yet it harbors a long forgotten warmth. Dance, my last stardust, etc., etc. This is a good song. It's such a good song. I love how it brings in, pieces of the actual Unlimited Blade Works chant there. It does have the lyric in English, Brave Shine, several times just to connect to those. It's so cool.
Yeah, it's great. And then one other piece of the episode, this is like, I think, a really smart piece of adaptation, is this is where they start putting in a little bit of stuff to give Saber more of an active presence here. Because if I remember correctly in the game, a lot of the stuff that she comments on, where she starts having this moment of self-reflection as well, I don't think that's in the game. I might be misremembering. But like, it doesn't strike me as something that would be in the game in this moment, because you would have already done the Fate route. There's no real reason to focus on Saber in that way. And it's something I think that's interesting, is that because in the Fate route in the game, Saber is very much paired and like paralleled with Shirou, like our Shirou, Kid Shirou, in that they both are people with these like very traumatic pasts, and they're trying to sort of like deal with that. Saber's trying to deal with it by getting the Holy Grail and going back and undoing it. Shirou is faced with like that option in the climax of the Fate route, and he turns it down. And it's like, and that is like the big moment where Saber fully realizes, you know, that the life she lived and where that has led her to was valuable, and that the past isn't something she should try to like discard. And so that's kind of the resolution in the game. Here, what I think is interesting is they kind of, it's similar, but they reframe it more as they parallel her with Archer. And have her reflecting on her younger self, looking at herself at the moment she pulled the sword from the stone and chose to walk the path of a king. And that is like the moment, they frame it here as like that's the moment she wants to undo specifically. And that is like equivalent to Archer trying to kill Shirou. And so her seeing this battle between Shirou and his own future self is like she's kind of imagining that with her own self. And that's one of the things that allows her to come at this point of like acceptance at the end of this story specifically, is that she has sort of learned by proxy for Shirou. And that like that element of it is still there in the game, but they don't like zoom in on it in the way that they do here. And I think some of those scenes are very smart. It's one thing that like elevates Saber a little bit more in the mix of the story that is nice, because you don't have the Fate route in the anime version.
Yeah, I love this whole scene. She says, what Archer is trying to kill is the self that gave rise to him, to wipe out the mistakes he is doomed to repeat in the future. Once they had a dream. And then she's seeing herself in the field with Excalibur and the stone. She says, once they had a dream, both were right. Both of them were right. And now she's talking to herself. It's just that the outcome was not what they wished for, even if nothing but regrets remained. If they were able to achieve many of their ideals in the process, then... kind of ... trailing off. But then that scene culminates in this amazing shot, one of my favorite shots in the series, that is a split like screen, but with kind of a fade in the middle where it's two versions of Saber facing each other. One, the maiden in the field in the dress, like, and it's all green pastures and blue sky, and one is the battlefield of her at the end of her entire path with all the swords in the ground. She's in her armor, bloodied, and the whole sky is gray and there's no grass anymore, and it's made to look like it's effectively the same field, just in two different times. And then you have Saber back turned to us in the center, bisecting the frame. Beautiful use of like the animated frame and image, and just like, yeah, and it's so fluidly done of having her, she is there in the scene, she's watching it, and just having this revelation in the moment of, oh right. And you also get a realization that Saber is probably more emotional mature than the other characters on screen here, because she's able to come to this conclusion with much less angst, but it's a really beautiful scene.
Yeah, and it's just, I really love what they do with the adaptation to bring Saber in and have her feel fully relevant in that scene, and have her like story arc feel like it resolves very satisfactorily, because like this is her moment of revelation as well as it is for Shirou.
Yeah. So doubling back on a couple of things, I just want to talk about how batshit insane the first couple episodes of this season are. Like, doubling back to, we ended, again, season 1 ends with this big twist where, you know, Castor we've already seen is kind of breaking the rules of the entire Holy Grail War, right? Because she's got her own servants and all of that stuff. And so this is really crazy. What the hell is Castor up to? And then that season ends with, oh shit, Castor has stolen Saber. You know, Shirou is no longer a master, all of that stuff. So that already feels like a big enough twist. Like, I think I intellectually thought at the end of that first season that was going to be the primary driver of season 2, was getting back Saber, defeating Castor, all of that kind of stuff. And instead, season 2 picks up, and in the first episode 1 of the second season, starts with them confronting Castor, getting completely fucked, and Archer betraying them and going over to Castor's side, and now neither of Rin or Shirou are masters. Then in the one after that, you have the decision, okay, we're gonna go try to team up with Berserker and Ilya. That seems like maybe our best course of action, because we have to get Castor, we have to get Saber back. all of that stuff. Well, then Ilya and Berserker get completely fucked by Gilgamesh, who has, unbeknownst to the rest of the characters, come into the fray and started, tearing shit up. So you have that. And then you do have them, they are able to kill Castor because it is revealed that Archer sort of did this as a pretense. This was part of a plan. He went over to Castor's side, but as a way of being able to defeat Castor, and he does effectively do that. And then at the end of the episode, he puts Rin in a cage of swords. He just throws down a bunch of swords around her. He's like, stay there, witch. And then he goes over and he's like, I'm going to kill this kid. I'm going to kill Shirou as a guardian. This is my role. And that's the first 5 episodes. That is an insane amount of plot that they move through in 5 episodes at the beginning of this season. Completely upending, I think, what your expectations would have been coming out of that first batch of episodes. And if the show were any less good, if the storytelling were any less good, I think it might even feel a little bit whiplashy, because they're not even done. In the second half, you have, Lancer gets involved, and you have Kotomine get killed very suddenly and all this stuff. It is a very twisty second season, up to and including the whole Archer and Shirou are the same person thing.
Yeah, it's really crazy. And there's a lot of really good stuff that's in that first 5 or 6 episodes, because this is also where now you get to learn most of the identities of the various servants. So, you learn that Castor is Medea from, the Jason the Argonauts myth, and then from the Greek tragedy play that also expands on the Medea character. That's where a lot of, her being a traitorous witch stuff comes from. And I've always really loved this choice to use Medea, who's that just right level of where she is a pretty prominent Greek mythological figure, but she's not the first person that sticks out in your mind when you think about Greek mythology. It's just enough of a deep cut that you're likely to know basically about her, but probably you don't know the whole thing. And I think I just love all their characterization of her. They go into more detail in some of her backstory here than they do in the game. Well, the backstory of her original master, right before she killed him and got Kuzuki. And I love all that. That stuff is not from the game. That's an original section made for the show. And
really? That's interesting, because it's really good.
Yeah, you learn about it in this, but it's just sort of explained to you that, she had a master and she betrayed that master and killed him, and then blah, blah, blah. But they actually dramatize it here. And I like Castor's character so much. There's something about the notion of Medea who, in the myth, the whole thing is that Jason, has to go sail to Colchis to get the Golden Fleece and bring it back so he can prove his birthright to be king of his homeland. And when he is there in Colchis trying to get the Golden Fleece, the gods, I think it's Aphrodite, I want to say, does some magic on Medea, who's the daughter of the king of Colchis, to make her fall in love with Jason. So she uses her magic that she knows to help Jason overcome various trials to be able to get the Golden Fleece, fighting the dragon skeleton soldiers is probably the most famous part there. But she ends up killing her brother when she and Jason are trying to escape Colchis. She ends up marrying Jason, but then later Jason marries this younger woman who's a princess of another land, and so Medea murders her own children and sets that lady to sort of seduce Jason on fire. And so that's kind of the bulk of her myth. And she's usually depicted as this the evil witch who's this traitorous woman, with, I think, kind of forgetting the whole starting point is that she never did any of this of her own free will. She was a young girl who was taken from her homeland effectively against her will for Jason. And I like the way that fate sort of turns that story on its head a little bit by taking Medea's side. And there's a great moment in that scene with her original master where he goes to Kotomine at the church and wants to have the pact undone or whatever, and he lays out she's this evil witch who burned her own children to death and all this stuff, and Kotomine Kide says oh, so that's how you interpreted her story, where he's clearly thought about from her perspective what would Medea understand about her own life, that all she really wants to do is go back home. All she wants to do is be able to live that life she originally wanted to have before the gods interfered and Jason showed up and all that shit happened. And so I've always really liked Castor's character. I think it's one of the cooler uses of mythology in Fate.
Yeah, it's a striking character. We talked about the vocal performance last time. It's fantastic and continues through these episodes. And I think her ending is very powerful. So Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, and then you get Kuzuki, who also, he's. I've always liked the scene where he, Castor is dead, so the magic that enhances him is worn off or whatever, and he still goes to fight Archer and just gets completely fucking murdered, because it's like, yeah, you're like this. They don't get super into his backstory, but he's like a crazy, weird assassin man. We might talk more about him on a different podcast we will record from this series, because he's relevant in something else in the Nasuverse in a way that I didn't realize until relatively recently. But he's like a weird assassin man, and so he's very highly trained, but no normal human can stand up against a servant. And so when he goes against Archer, he just is dispatched of very easily.
Yeah. We also, through this entire stretch, get a lot of Lancer, and who we had gotten a little bit of in the first season. He's in the first couple of episodes. He's involved in kind of our first little, fights that we have in this series. I fucking love this version of Lancer. He is so cool. He's one of the coolest characters in this series. I love him to death. Voiced by Nobutoshi Kana, who I looked through his credits because I'm like, this is such a great vocal performance. It's like, it's a fairly, I feel like, almost unique take on the like kind of cool character archetype. He's got a unique voice, and I love it. And I wasn't familiar with a lot of his work, but I did learn he is the Japanese voice of Knuckles the Echidna. And now I want to go watch all of Japanese Sonic stuff, because that sounds like the most perfect voice of Knuckles you could possibly have is Lancer from Unlimited Blade Works. God, I really like this character. And of course, he's involved in some amazing action. He has a great fight with Archer where he has his special spear, Guy Bolg, that he uses. And then, of course, you have, like Lancer in Fate Zero, he dies by being ordered to kill himself. It's an unfortunate quirk of the Lancer class, is they have the worst deaths, but he takes Kodomine out with him because he is just the ultimate badass in this series. Really steals the show for a couple episodes there.
Yeah, no, Lancer is one of my favorites. It's fucking great. Yeah, I also had this revelation about the Knuckles thing a few months ago when there was, for Sonic Frontiers, they made this like 8-minute long little animation thing that's on YouTube. That's like sets up how Knuckles gets involved in that game and how he ends up on that island. It's really good. If people have not seen it, I highly recommend watching it. Then there's an English dub version, which I watched at first because even though Sonic is technically a Japanese thing, English is really the language that it is made for, because it's way more popular in America than it is in Japan. But then I was like, I should watch the Japanese version, because I don't think I've ever heard Japanese Knuckles. I've heard like Japanese Sonic before and stuff. And that's where I was like, wait, is that fucking Lancer? Oh my God, it's fucking Lancer. And it was like, I felt like my brain exploded, because yeah, I feel like Nobutoshi Kana is like a great voice actor who's not like, he hasn't been in a lot of stuff recently. He has some like good older roles and stuff that he is more known for, like he's a guy in Saint Seiya, I'm pretty sure. Yes, yeah. But yeah, Nobutoshi Kana, Lancer, or Cuckoo Lane, they don't really go into any of his like mythological stuff, but he's like, if there is one Irish mythological hero, it is fucking Cuckoo Lane, or the Hound of Culain. And it's just, Cuckoo Lane is an awesome mythological character. I like that in Fate Zero, in Fate Stay Night, they kind of, when they made Fate Zero, they kind of made Diarmuid as this sort of parallel, so that we have our two Lancers are both from Irish mythology, which is cool, although they're from different eras of Irish mythology. But yeah, with Lancer, he has what might be my favorite scene of the show, certainly like in terms of a non-dramatic scene, which is when he decides to team up with Shirou and Nin, and they like start making that deal. And then Shirou says like, okay, if we're going to do this, I have one condition. Just because you're like teaming up with us doesn't mean you can get so chummy with Tosaka.
It sounds such a good scene.
Where he's like, what the fuck is this kid talking about? And then he puts like it together and then just starts losing his shit. And then that's where the moment where you feel like, oh, he's actually committed to really help these kids. And that's like, how he is for the rest of the show. Is that like, he wants to be a hero. He doesn't want to do any of this like sneaking around, stabbing kids in the heart shit that he was doing in the first couple of episodes. Which he has some lines there to that effect. You just don't know enough about the character to know like what his whole deal is. But that's where he actually gets some respect for Shirou and Nin and realizes that like they're good people at heart, right? They have this kind of slightly, Shirou has this kind of old-fashioned mindset that I think very much speaks to Lancer. And that just whole conversation that they have where they're both talking about being right in front of her. And it's just like, oh, you're in for a whole lot, kid. And he's like, yeah, no, I've known for a while that Tosaka is a handful. She just loses her shit. I fucking adore that scene. It's so funny.
Yes, it's so good, and as you were saying with Knuckles, like now I know Discotech is preparing to release Sonic X in the U.S. in Japanese for the first time. That's a show that's been really hard to find in its original language. I might have to check that out now, just because I know what Knuckles sounds like, and that excites me. And I just don't have a lot of exposure to the Japanese Sonic cast, which is a really good cast. It just doesn't get a lot of attention because, as you say, Sonic is kind of an English first franchise, even though it's got an A-list cast in Japan, so absolutely. But anyway, Lancer rocks. I'm sorry he had to die by stabbing himself, but at least this Lancer does get to take Kotomine out with him. And I do, even though Kotomine not in this series a ton, it is extraordinarily satisfying to see him effectively hoisted on his own petard here and die a horrible death. It's great.
Yeah, I mean, because one of the things with all of Kotomine's stuff here is you also have to understand that, like, if you were playing the game, you would already know that he was Lancer's master by this point. I think that's one of the reasons why that reveal goes by, like, super fast, is because you would have known that. That's all comes up in the first route and stuff.
It was a true surprise for me. I was, like, gaming it out. I was trying to guess around it. I had a whole theory that it was Sakura because we were going to learn something because I know she's the main character of the third route. But no, it was Kotomine.
Yeah, never saw Kotomine. He's, he's once a cheating bastard, always a cheating bastard,
Yes.
But yes, yeah. So if it existed, if this was like the only animated thing for Fate Stay Night and Kotomine Kide, it would be unsatisfying. He gets a lot more stuff. So like, I think you could just enjoy his stuff here for what it is, which he does just get a very satisfying death where, he thinks he's so cocksure about it. And then Lancer just gets up and fucking just stabs him straight through the heart, which is kind of Lancer's whole deal. And he just gets this badass line. It's like, come on, you idiot. Like, if something like that were just enough to kill me, I would have no business being a heroic spirit.
Yes. And with all of that bloodshed done, we then have our true antagonist of the end of Unlimited Blade Works, which is Gilgamesh, taking center stage. I enjoyed Gilgamesh quite a bit in Fate Zero, as y'all know. But in Unlimited Blade Works, good God, he is the biggest fucking prick. He is the most evil piece of shit villain who just, like, I don't even know if you can describe him quite as evil because he has no concept of morality. They so push the idea of he just sees the world as his. He sees everyone as lesser. And then he gets the ultimate fucking comeuppance in that he is not just beaten by Shirou, but he gets his goddamn arm cut off while he is preparing to use Aya. The animation on his face in those final couple episodes as he is humiliated, Tomokazu Seki losing his shit in these episodes is up there for me with Mamoru Miyano in the final episodes of Death Note as Light losing his just like of the ultimate, like, egotistical maniac villain character losing their shit as they are humbled. It is the most satisfying series of confrontations. One of the great villains in the history of anime. Oh my god.
Yeah, no, it's amazing. I love, that they have here. It is him. He never in this version ever gets into the gold armor, which I love. So he is just always in his sort of modern day outfit with his hair down and the black jacket and stuff, which that is from the game, to be clear. So that's like very much the game does that. There in some of the other routes, you see him in the gold armor get up. But here he's just fucking chilling, because this is the route where he's basically on his own, for the whole most of the second half. Like, Kotomine is dead. It's just Gilgamesh doing his shit. You learn that his whole thing is he just looks out at all these, like, mongrels that have spread across the earth, and he has this whole explanation he gives to Shinji, who's also a real piece of shit the fucking second half of this show.
Yes.
It's the only regret I have for the way Unlimited Blade Works ends is that Shinji survives. It's like, we could throw him back into the muck, please. Just like, get rid of him. But Gilgamesh has that speech where he says, when he was king, and I don't know if this is based on an actual myth from Gilgamesh or not. I don't remember. But he has this thing of, he had 8 servants brought to him or whatever, and he would kill any of them that were, like, unnecessary, that nobody would miss them if they were gone, and he found that he couldn't kill a single one. And then he looks out at, like, the world today, and he's like, how many people could I kill? And with those same conditions, 1, 10, 100, 1,000, 10,000, who knows how many. And there's something about that just sense of him sort of this king who has come back to his lawn and has found a bunch of weeds growing there is like just how he views all of humanity. And there's just such a like natural, it's such a natural part of how he views the world that, yeah, it's like there are lots of other villains that on the face of it are similar to Gilgamesh, but nobody has the fucking swagger that dude has. Like Gilgamesh just has such a purely realized arrogance to him that you fully believe it. You just fully believe, yeah, this is just how he sees the world, and there's nothing else to it. There's nothing like deeper really going on there. He is just like the king of heroes, and he views the world and everything in it as his own.
Yeah, it's, you know, I was having a Twitter conversation with one of our listeners the other day where he saw that I made one tweet about Unlimited. I made my joke about the theme songs being too good. And he asked me, oh, hey, now you're in deep enough. Who's your favorite servant? And I think the answer I gave was Ryder from Fate Zero because, you know, he's my boy. And he said, yeah, my favorite is Gilgamesh. That dude is such a cocksucker. And I'm like, that word, I know that word has like problematic like tones now, but it's the best word for him. I'm sorry. Yeah. If you are like our age, I just, again, the word not being, that word not more used in the Deadwood sense of the word, right? Not as like a slur, but just as a like, God, that dude is a fucking cocksucker. He's so shitty. I can imagine fucking Ian McShane from Deadwood looking at this guy and calling him a cocksucker because he is such a piece of shit, but he is also like, so righteous in his piece of shittery. What an amazing villain. And again, if you are an anime viewer, you're not coming from the visual novel, you're just watching this in the ufotable order like I am, this is so effective as a sequel to Fate Zero because Gilgamesh, this is his whole motivation here is a direct follow-up on one of the central thematic dialogues of Fate Zero, which is what is the role of a king, right? Mm-hmm. And like his whole thing here comes out of that big Grail discussion episode where they have the big meeting of kings. And then you have his whole goal is to make the end of Fate Zero happen on a global scale instead of just the city. So it's like, okay, we're one-upping from the end of the first series now here, and we have the survivor from that, Shirou, having to confront that and stop it. It just, again, works so seamlessly as if you are coming from Fate Zero. This just works beautifully as a sequel, and part of that is the role Gilgamesh plays here. And then the penultimate episode, there's a couple of sequences I would put up here with this. Also ones from Ufotable, like, you know, Tanjiro going toe-to-toe with Rui in the forest in episode 19 of Kimetsu no Yaiba. Mm-hmm. But, like, this is one of the most fucking satisfying fight scenes I have ever seen of Shirou, who has gotten the crest from Tosaka, and so now he can use all this mana, creating the Unlimited Blade Works, creating the Reality Marble, bringing him in here, and then explaining, like, you are the one master or servant I could beat because you never mastered one noble phantasm. You have 1,000, and I can just copy them all, motherfucker. And that whole idea, the way Shirou takes him to task, the animation, there are just some god-tier pieces of animation of Shirou running around, batting off all of the swords, jumping through the air. Just, you can tell, like, it's like there's no in-between frames. It's just every frame is a key frame. And then the big final blow of jumping in and cutting off Gilgamesh's arm, and the look on his face, just a perfect piece of animation. I again, just stand up and cheer. It's so good.
Yeah, and it's all just so well set up as a fight, right? Because they've been sort of seeding this idea since Archer was seemingly killed. You know, he actually escaped and gets, like, you know, actually, as Shirou complains about at the end of that episode, he gets to steal the whole fucking show because Archer likes to show the fuck off. But ever since Archer's supposed demise, where he pushes Shirou out of the way, doing a very Miyashiro-esque thing, you know, where it's like he sacrifices himself to save somebody else and tells him, like, you defeat him. And then Shirou's, you know, he's the only person who can beat Gilgamesh. And I think the reasoning of it stands so well. Like, I think it's like, you know, especially if you're just watching the anime stuff and you're coming from Fate Zero, I think the question of, like, how does anyone beat Gilgamesh is such a big one, you know? And in this, you've seen him, like, just wipe the floor with Berserker. It's like, how could anybody possibly beat this guy? And I think the answer of, well, the only one can beat him is, like, the faker, right? It's the person who has nothing of their own but can copy whatever anybody else has. as long as it's just the weapon, right? Shirou can't copy the abilities of any other servant, but as long as Gilgamesh is in Unlimited Blade Works, Shirou can copy his fucking Noble Phantasms faster than Gilgamesh can, like, launch them out of the gates of Babylon. Because as soon as they exist in Unlimited Blade Works, like, the copy exists in Unlimited Blade Works, right? Like, as, like, a matter of fact, if Shirou sees it, it must exist within Unlimited Blade Works. That's how, like, that reality marble functions. And so I think that reasoning that Shirou gives of, like, anybody else, I would not stand a chance. If it was Saber here, or Archer, or Lancer, or Caster, or Heracles, or whoever, Shirou would be dead within fucking half of a second. And similarly, were it any other hero standing up against Gilgamesh, they also would be dead. Because also Shirou would stand no chance against Saber, because if he can't make all the weapons that Gilgamesh has unless he's fighting against Gilgamesh and he's able to see them, right? So it's like he can't bring out this arsenal against anyone other than Gilgamesh because he just copies Gilgamesh's arsenal. It's just like the one pairing that can bring Gilgamesh down, but then of course it has that logical element, and it also has the thematic element of it has to be a lowly human, right? It also has to be someone that Gilgamesh underestimates, because if he had ever at one point in the fight before the very end taken Shirou seriously, he could have beaten him, right? Like if Gilgamesh had used Ea, Shirou can't copy Ea. Like Ea is like a primordial fucking god sword from before the world existed or some crazy bullshit. Like that's on, I don't even know if it's technically a sword or whatever kind of level of, it's a concept that Gilgamesh is using. You know, it's a crazy anime nonsense. And they add in for Unlimited Blade Works, this scene doesn't exist in the game. They add in that little moment where the Grail tries to go grab Gilgamesh and he brings Ea out to blow up the arm, so that they can set up within the scope of this fight that specific thing of Gilgamesh has a fucking get out of jail free card in his back pocket throughout the entire fight. But he has this line where he says, Shirou, like, you know, being a king is a real pain in the ass. Because if the moment I take a fight with someone like you seriously is the moment that I lose, right? He can't be a king and also fight like a mongrel seriously, because it just sort of knocks him from his pedestal. And so that moment where Shirou, you know, blocks a bunch of Gilgamesh's attacks, goes launching up into the air, uses Roaius, the shield of Ajax from the Iliad, which we've seen Archer use before in the fight with Lancer, to block a bunch of other attacks, summons one of Archer's short swords, and then comes down. And as he's coming down, I love the detail that Gilgamesh reaches for Ea, like it comes out of the gates of Babylon, he reaches for it, he hesitates for a second, then he grabs it, and right as he grabs it is when Shirou comes down and cuts his arm off. So it's like, if Gilgamesh had decided 1 second earlier to actually take Shirou seriously, the fight would have been over. So it's like the only reason that Gilgamesh lost was purely through his own arrogance. And it's the way that's all told visually through the fight is fucking phenomenal.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And you're so right, because it's like, again, it's this show is very good at like literalizing ideas through the visuals of the sword comes down and he loses his arm the moment he goes and hesitates for Ea, right? It is his own arrogance that kills him. But again, just the sheer rage he gets into in the second half of this fight, the performance by Tomokazu Seki. There's this one line that I love. I think it's after he first, like, loses in an exchange with Shirou and, like, he's one of his swords destroyed. And Shirou gives the whole explanation where he says, you know, you're like me, jack of all trades, master of one. His rejoinder to that, and this is such a good translation, because I can imagine, like, a Saturday morning cartoon villain saying it. When I'm done with you, there won't be a single bone shard left of your counterfeiting cranium. I love it. I love that because it so fits in Gilgamesh's mouth, but I can also imagine Skeletor saying it to He-Man. Yes. When I'm done with you, there won't be a single bone shard left of your counterfeiting cranium.
Yes, no, it's Gilgamesh starts to lose his composure, and he's basically, you know, that would be a moment where in the fan subs you could pretty much justify throwing some F-bombs or something in there if you wanted. Because Gilgamesh starts to lose his shit. And they set it up well also of like he has a real animosity towards Archer in the couple of other scenes they're in together where he calls him Faker and stuff like that. You know, so they've seeded the idea that Gilgamesh clearly is aware that like this is the only thing that could possibly hurt him or like beat his ability, but also his arrogance is such that he can't fathom the idea that somebody copying the original that could be good enough, that it's like, because his whole thing is that he is the original hero. He's from the beginning of time. He has all the original noble phantasms, the things that all the later noble phantasms are based on. And that none of that shit, none of these mongrels, which is that word mongrel he uses is a very literal translation of what he says in Japanese, zashu. Like that, it's like, mixed blood, it's someone who's like diluted, it's like you're not pure. And so there's nothing, he can't imagine something like that being able to stand up against the original. But that's Shido's whole fucking deal, is that nothing about him is original. Everything he is borrowed from Kiritsugu and stuff like that. But it doesn't matter if it's borrowed or not, like it's still his. And that's part of it. Just makes it a perfect fight. Conceptually, a perfect fight in terms of execution. It is definitely one of the all-time great anime fights ever, is Shiro fighting Gilgamesh.
Yes, because again, at the beginning, if you're coming out of Fate Zero or however you've been introduced to Gilgamesh, your initial expectation would not be that Shiro is the one who's going to take him down, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, honestly, early on, I'm like, okay, we're going to finally get the Saber on Gilgamesh rematch. And the show very clearly, like, Saber keeps coming in like, time for the rematch. And Shiro's like, no, I got this. You go do the other thing. You've got something else to do. And I love it, because Saber is raring for a fight with this fucking cocksucker.
I love it. They have that dinner table scene, like, that's the kind of like Quiet Before the Storm episode, where Saber is like, as you say, like kind of raring, says like, I'll go take out Gilgamesh. And then Shiro just sort of casually says, it's like, no, Saber, you wouldn't even stand a chance against him. And Saber's like so offended at it. She realizes like, probably should have said that a little softer. Yes. It's like, but it's true, she's poorly matched against Gilgamesh, but she does get to have a really sick fucking fight with Assassin though.
That is that's a good fight. I almost forgot about that. But yeah, that works. That's a great scene.
Yeah. Poor old Sasaki Kojiro, all he got to do was hang out on some stairs and get his, like, rib cage ripped out shit. All he wanted to do was fight the pretty girl,
But he got it. She, yep. Saber gave him a good fight in the end. I like that moment when Saber realizes he's disappearing, goes, I'm sorry, dude. I've been pulling my punches. Let's do this for real. Saber's very noble. It's very good.
Yeah. And I love Assassin's last line where he says, something like, I took her for being like a pretty little bird, but it turns out that she must be some kind of lion. I never really did have luck with women. And then he disappears. It's a great parting line. Scene.
Oh, it's so good. And of course, we have Archer's role in this episode, which is to come in at the last moment as Gilgamesh is trying to pull Shiro into the Grail with him.
No, that's not what he's doing. He says very specifically, I love this moment where Shiro says, are you trying to pull me in? And Gilgamesh says, no, fuck you. Like, you stay right there and I'm going to pull myself out. And it's such a fucking great moment where he's like, no, you stay there, mongrel. I'm pulling myself out of here.
You're so right, because that's what fucking makes it. It's because Gilgamesh is still arrogant enough to think that after all of this, he can order Shiro around and be like, stay there, plant your feet, I'm coming out. Yes, and so you have Shiro saying, I will lose my arm if I have to pull you in there. And then it's Archer's like, well, do it if you must, but first can you step to the left a little? And I'm like, oh. And then he just gets a knife to the forehead and dies. Stand up, cheer. Oh my God. Perfect ending.
Yeah, it's such a fucking incredible ending. Like the moment where Gilgamesh says, like, no, you stay there and I'm pulling myself out. I just, it's so good because Gilgamesh is like, part of his arrogance is also like, he doesn't really give a shit if Imiyashiro lives or dies. Like, even with his arm cut off, like he's going to kill Imiyashiro, but like, he's not petty in the way that I'm going to take you with me if I have to. So it's like, no, like I don't think that thought even probably crossed Gilgamesh's head until she just said, he's like, no, I'm just trying to get out, you stupid mongrel.
He's the ultimate narcissist. Shiro doesn't exist, like at a certain point, right? Yeah. Speaking of which, before we actually talk about the final Archer scene, is this the route where Gilgamesh is most prominent in Fate Stay Night? I'm curious.
Yeah, probably.
Okay.
I would say so. He's like, I won't comment on Heaven's Feel because we'll see those movies, but he and Kodamine are like about equally prominent in the Fate route. The Fate route boils down more or less to like Shiro gets paired off with fighting Kodamine at the end. Saber gets paired off with fighting Gilgamesh at the end.
Okay.
I mean, it's kind of like a four-way fight, but that's kind of how it splits out. So they're more or less given equal weighting. And that's kind of how the Fate route goes.
Okay, so we do get a Saber Gilgamesh rematch, just not in this one. Okay, good. I'm glad that exists somewhere, and maybe one day ufotable can animate it for us, because I would like to see that.
I would appreciate it. I would really love if they made a Fate. Like, it could be a couple of movies. I think you'd probably do it in, honestly, 2 movies, because, you don't need to do all the backstory stuff, so.
Yeah.
Please.
All right. Archer's final scene. He is up on the hill. One of the most beautiful ufotable backdrops I have ever seen, which is saying something. I've already made it a wallpaper on my computer, and has his final scene as he's disappearing with Tosaka. And I love this scene. I love how we see him from the back for a while, and then when he turns around, we only see him from, like, the mouth down. And then finally, when we get the full reveal, we see how much he looks like Shirou, like, for the first time.
His hair is down, and so with his hair comes down, it's got the same kind of shaggy look that Shirou's has.
And it's also just, like, very good character animation, where just the way he holds himself and everything, he's not putting on a pretense. He's letting Tosaka see that he is Emiya, right?
Yes.
I am the person you knew. And he has these lines: look after me. As you know, I'm a bit hopeless. Give me a shoulder to lean on. And my other favorite Kana Ueda moment in the series is her coming back and saying, I know, I'll do my best. I'll try my hardest to make sure he doesn't end up a twisted jerk like you. I'll make sure he learns to love himself. So you hang in there too. And again, this might actually be my favorite single moment of character animation in the entire series, is just Tosaka coming back and saying, I want to make sure, he learns to love himself. And just the smile on her face as she pushes through the tears to, like, give Archer this happy final moment. It's incredible. It's a stunning piece of character animation.
Yeah, and then the last line of the exchange is the one that really gets me, because this is when Archer looks at her and he says, Daijoubu da yo, Tosaka. Kore kara ganbatte iku kara. Or, don't worry, Tosaka, I'll try my hardest from now on too. But there's, like, this is one of those where if you know enough about Japanese to catch some of, like, the name stuff, right? For the whole show, Archer calls her Dean. That's actually something they specifically established in the prologue, where they have a conversation about how he should address her. Shirou always calls her Tosaka. And so in that moment, that's the moment where he fully reverts to being Shirou, is him saying, don't worry, Tosaka, I'll try my hardest from now on too. And he smiles. And that's also where Junichi Suabe is clearly, like, really trying to emulate some of the, like, kind of tics or whatever of the voice that Sugiyama does for Shirou. And that's, like, the time you most get to see it, and then he fades away. It always really gets me, that moment.
It's beautiful. And then the final moment of the episode is her turning around and seeing Shirou, who is standing there in clothes and tatters, covered in blood, and he just does this goofy little, he raises his arm like, hi, and has this dumb little smile. It's hilarious. And then she turns around and is teary-eyed, but then she forces herself to kind of smile and does this thumbs up. Another one of my favorite images in the series. And they go home together. And we've still got the epilogue, but just that alone is a perfect little ending.
Yeah. And also, for Shirou, like, Saber's gone now, so it's like all that magic healing shit. It's like he's gonna have to fucking work on that on his own.
Yeah. Shirou's like, okay, let's go home, but first, the hospital. I need some stitches.
Yeah, like,
yes.
if the epilogue was more realistic when they show the section that happens 1 month after the ending, he should have just been, like, in the hospital with, like, a full body cast. It's like, oh, shit.
Yes. Question, by the way, here. So the way he's able to do all the unlimited blade work stuff in this episode is that he gets part of Tosaka's magic crest and is able to borrow her mana. Is that the sex scene in the visual novel when they exchange? Okay.
Yeah.
Because they in the TV version, and I assume the PS2 all ages version, they have to get undressed to a certain extent for it, but it is not a sex scene. But I can see how it could become a sex scene.
Yes, yeah. So the whole idea is that they have to be, like, they have to share, like, an intimate connection in order to, like, pass mana between them. And, like, one of the easiest ways to do that is to have sex. And so that's, like, and then also, obviously, they're, like, in a relationship at this point, very clearly. And that's, like, the sex scene in Unlimited Blade Works is one of the ones that I think actually, honestly, works pretty well in the original game, because it's not particularly erotic in any way, because it's 2 teenagers having sex for the first time. So it's, like, they're, like, both very awkward about it. It's, like, it's honestly, like, quite endearing. But yes, that is the scene. And because then, and then after that is when, like, in the game, Shirou has this vision of where he sees some of Tosaka's memories, and that's where he has the vision of her watching him, although he doesn't fully understand what's going on, when they're both in middle school on that like evening when the sun's coming down, and she's watching him do these high jumps outside over and over again. Like all that stuff's also from the game.
Yeah. I understand, obviously, this is a TV show, why they couldn't do the sex scene. I do kind of think it's a little weird how chaste they are in the final episodes. It's not fully explicit, even in the epilogue, that they're in, like, a romantic relationship. There's no kiss or hand-holding or anything. And I felt like that was... Because, like, in the series lore, they are, right? Like, they're in a relationship. It just doesn't... I don't know. I feel like it could have been made... When I say more explicit, I don't mean they get naked and fuck, but it could have been more explicit a little bit, I felt like.
Yeah, I think, it's like, I definitely, like, read the epilogue that they definitely, I mean, they're fucking living together,
Right, yes, but,
yes.
It's fine. It's just something I noticed. But let's talk about that epilogue. So the epilogue is sort of split in half, where we start in the clock tower a couple of years later, and they're both learning magic, and then we flash back to a month after the conflict and kind of get some resolution on that. And then we kind of have this final interrogation of Shirou's ideals. And like I said, the ending, I think, leaves you unsettled in very specific and interesting ways.
Yeah, so just for some context for, like, how this is adapting the game, the section that's, like, the 1 month later, all of that, and it's longer in the game, but that is the stuff that is from the game. The game doesn't have any of the 2 years later in Clock Tower. That whole area is totally original for the anime. Now, again, some of the, like, ideas that are expressed there are, like, similar to other scenes that were in the epilogue from the game that just take place the 1 month later. But this is one of my favorite things as a fan of the game, is this epilogue and that 2 years later section, because it's stuff that, like, they're pulling from some things from, like, the kind of pseudo-sequel game Fate Hollow Atraxia, with some of the characters like Luvia. Obviously, you've got Lord El Meloy II / Waver here. So it's like some of the bits and bobs that they pull, and like the notion of Tosaka going to the clock towers from some other stuff, are from some of like the ephemera around the Fate series. But we've never actually seen, like, 2 years after Fate Stay Night, a continuation of this ending. And it's very satisfying from that point of view as a fan of the game. Just to see, like, a slightly more grown-up version of these characters still struggling with the very, like, unsettled nature of Shirou's life from the end of Unlimited Blade Works.
That's really interesting. I would have assumed the Lord El Meloy scene is original to the anime, because Waver Velvet is not in the visual novel, right?
No,
right.
He had not been conceived of by the time the visual novel came out.
So I was pretty sure that was new, but I would have guessed that. I mean, it feels very seamless. It feels like the natural end to this story to jump ahead. I think the character redesigns are really, really good, especially on Tosaka. Shirou is always kind of boyish, although he's, obviously older in this scene, but I think the way Reen has, like, let her hair long and all of that. Well, witches have to let their hair. I learned this from Witch on the Holy Night, the visual novel. Hair has powers. We can talk about, we'll do that in our hair episode on the Kinoko Nasu verse next week. No, but anyway, so you have all of that. But yeah, overall, I think it's a really interesting scene, because it is, the thing that is offered to Shirou at the clock tower is he is offered admission into the Mage Association, and he could become an official part of this. But of course he rejects it, as of course Shirou would reject that.
Yes.
Like, that's not, and I really like the Lord El Meloy, Waver Velvet scene where Waver's like, yeah, that is a stupid fucking wish, kid. But if you have that wish, you probably shouldn't be a mage. I really like his, like, reasoning there. It's really funny. It's not as vulgar as I said, but you have that. And then you have this final conversation with them. And you have, after the credits, you have Junichi Suwabe come back for a final monologue as Archer, where he says, "A boy once said, 'I don't want to watch people die. Shouldn't it be possible to save all who suffer?' What the boy was trying to cut down was himself. He wielded his sword for what he came to believe in. There is no longer a path where his battle ends and he turns back. However, he did get his answer. He has regrets, and he doesn't know how many times he has wished to do it all over. This fate is set in stone, and Emiya will probably go on cursing it. But even still, I was not wrong." And we have Archer in the Unlimited Blade Works here. We have him disappear, and then we have a cut to Emiya in the desert, on a journey, like we saw Archer in one of Archer's flashbacks, and he smiles and the series ends. Yeah, I'm still not sure what I'm supposed to take away from that, other than that it kind of feels like, and I'm curious, is that monologue from the game? Is that from the visual novel?
I think so. I don't remember specifically.
It almost feels like the end of a route, kind of like suggesting that there is another path, because he's literally saying, like, this path is set in stone, this is what is going on, but kind of making you think about alternatives. I don't know, does that reading make sense?
Yes, because I think it's an open question at the end of the Unlimited Blade Works route. Like, which Shirou becomes Archer, right? Is a question. Like, is it maybe the Fate route Shirou becomes Archer because he never confronted any of this? Like, did Archer have these experiences in his living life? Like, did he encounter his own future self as well? Like, that's like an open question, because it's never been like specifically clarified as far as my knowledge. Like, if there is one of the Shirous that specifically is meant to be the one that becomes Archer. In my head, I've always seen it as the Fate route Shirou is the one who becomes eventually Archer. This one, maybe he does, and then we'll see with Heaven's Feel, like, where that story goes. But for this one, it feels like he probably does, but there's a chance, right? It's like, right. It's kind of like the thing that Dean says in her monologue to Shirou in this, where it's like, you are definitely walking the same path, but maybe you can get further, right? Like, maybe, he doesn't end up being betrayed and, like, has that specific, like, death. Maybe there is, like, a way he can work past that point if Tosaka is able to get him to care more about himself and stuff. So there's, like, I think a glimmer of hope, but it still feels like he will almost certainly still end up as Archer in some form, but maybe a happier, better version of Archer is, I think, kind of like the implication to me at the end.
And I guess this is where I just like to clarify, Fate Stay Night, so the visual novel, these are three separate stories. There are three separate continuities, effectively, right?
Yes.
But they are meant to be read in a certain order, so there is clearly some kind of, like, evolution you come to understand of possibilities for this character, Shirou Emiya. Okay.
Yes, I think it will be very clear when you watch Heaven's Feel, it is a sequel to this story, even if it is technically taking place. It's not a sequel in a chronological sense, but in a thematic sense, it is building on all of these ideas. Absolutely.
Right. This is an interesting question. How does the larger, like, Fate universe, like Fate Grand Order and stuff, deal with that Fate Stay Night has no one single ending?
It's all set in, like,
the
maybe
multiverse.
It's the same universe, maybe it's not. I mean, none of these characters... None of these characters really show up in Fate Grand Order in the sense that, like, heroic spirits, when they are summoned, are never the same heroic spirit, right? It's like Saber, other than Saber, who we already went her whole thing in the last episode where she's not a normal heroic spirit, but, like, let's say Lancer, right? Cuckoo Lancer is not going to remember any of this shit, but he's summoned from the Throne of Heroes again, because time has no meaning for a heroic spirit. Like, I don't even know... technically, if Archer... I guess I don't know how Counter Guardians work in that way. I don't know if Archer technically is really going to retain all of his memories of this stuff, or maybe if there's just, like, a glimmer of something that is retained when he comes back to the Throne of Heroes or something. But yeah, so in Fate Grand Order, none of that is, like, really addressed. Fate Holotraxia is a whole weird conversation about what that game's story is as a sort of sequel to Fate Stay Night that tries to account to some extent with... Because Fate Holotraxia does not take place really after any of the endings for Fate Stay Night, because all the characters are still alive in that game, and so it's complicated. So, like, to put it more simply, there has never been an actual sequel to Fate Stay Night, because there has never been a story that is really set after any of the roots from this game. Everything is, like, vaguely might be set into the same world, or it might be a parallel universe kind of thing.
Okay. I was just curious, and maybe some of our listeners were too if they have not read the visual novel, so I thought I might as well ask. What else to say about Unlimited Blade Works? Is there anything else you want to talk about with this epilogue specifically?
Just that I fucking, as a fan, I adore it. So some of the stuff like Luvia, or Luvia Gelita Edelfelt, who is the blonde-haired woman who has a crush on Shirou, as she calls him, and has a fight with Tosaka. That is a character that's from Fate Holotraxia, the kind of sequel to Fate Stay Night, and I've always loved that character, and she's in some of the other spin-offs as well, so it was fun to have her here, Waver getting to have a cameo. I love the idea of Shirou and Tosaka going to Glastonbury, which is where the, like supposed grave of King Arthur is. Like that's a real place. Like from what I understand, like they've actually visited there to do the backgrounds and stuff and model it after the real place.
That's a beautiful scene. I really like that. Yeah.
Yeah. Like all that stuff is like if you had played the game and this was like you coming back to the story in animated form, the epilogue is just like a real treat. And I think it was a smart idea to give a full epilogue episode rather than trying to sort of like pace the episodes out so that all that 1 month later stuff happened in like the second half of the final episode or something, which is how most anime would do this. Like the story is big enough that I think it like warrants having a full epilogue episode. And so all those like little additions they do, I think are really, really smart. It's just one of my favorite episodes of this show.
Yeah, no, I'm very glad it exists. And in kind of the same way as the epilogue for Kara no Kyokai, I like that it pushes you a little bit. I like that it complicates it. It's not a easy, he will become Archer, he won't become Archer. It's, and which one of those is good, which one of those is bad. It really is like, well, this is a person still in development, and he's in a specific place, but this is the path he's sort of chosen to walk, albeit with he and Rin are very clearly committed to each other, right?
Yes.
And so I think that final scene, Junichi Suwabe's final narration, I love that he gets the final lines because it's just, to me, kind of the defining performance of this anime in particular is him to me. And it's a very powerful closing.
Absolutely. Yeah. It's great.
It's great. One thing we haven't talked much about in this episode, Sean, we talked about it last time, is just the musical score for this show is so ludicrously good. We are being spoiled this season on Japanimation Station between Yuki Kajiura's stuff and then everything here. The music I think is very good in the first half, and we talked about like Archer's theme is so cool and stuff like that. But I think it really takes off in the second half here. There are so many beautiful pieces in this half of the show, so many good action pieces. The final end credits run under a piece of score, not under like a song or something, and I think that's like really haunting. It's you kind of pull out from Rin and Shirou in their house together in England, and then you pull out and you get this like run through the Unlimited Blade Works space with the credits rolling and this like really intense piece of music. It's really striking from start to finish.
Yeah, and one thing that the second season does is it starts building in themes from the game that are then the redone versions are by the people who composed those themes for the game. So there's a few of like, obviously they play the Sword of Promise Victory song when Saber uses Excalibur to blow up the Grail, which is fucking sick and like an incredible fucking sequence of animation.
Yeah.
And a good version of that song. You get, I think this plays over Archer's thing at the end, or it might be an earlier scene of the epilogue. There's a scene in the epilogue where they play an instrumental version of This Illusion, that the Lisa song from the end of season 1, that is also the opening theme for the original game. That is the one that most jumps out at me is like, oh my god, this is the game song, because it just like, as with lots of visual novels, they really like using, if they have a nice lyrical theme they got put together for the opening video, they like to do like 6 different instrumental versions of that song. So that is really good. But for me, the big one, and I don't know if you hadn't played the game, I don't know if this song will have stood out or not. But for me, as somebody coming from the game, one of the most well-known songs from the game is the Emiya theme that plays whenever they use the Unlimited Blade Works. Which is a theme that like it starts with this very ominous like kind of like chanting, and then you get this almost like alarm sound that comes up, this like and then eventually after that plays for a while, you get this nice piano theme that's like ba da da dum bum bum ba, and so on and so forth. Like it's a very iconic, memorable piece of music from the game. And one of the things I love is that Archer theme that you heard a lot in the first half of the show is the Emiya theme. It's the same chord progression, and they arpeggiate the chords on electric guitar. And then you get that counter melody is kind of like hints at the main melody from the Emiya theme. So you get this kind of like dark rock version of that Unlimited Blade Works song, that never really fully culminates into that big sweeping piano melody that the main song does. It's one of the reasons why that's one of my favorite pieces of music, is that I think it subtly is like setting up the idea of Archer and Emiya, because that, if you know the song and the music from the game, like I think that will like start to stand out to you after you've heard that theme a few times. And it's like just a really great piece of music writing.
It's one of my favorite pieces in the show. I didn't know it was from the game or whatever, but I did. It comes back every time you're in the Unlimited Blade Works, and they add more to it every time. And if you go to the soundtrack, they clearly say like this is version 1, version 2, whatever. And it's really cool to listen to them because it is a really striking piece of music.
Yeah, and that's where like if you wanted, you could listen to like a 2-hour supercut on YouTube of all the different versions of the Emiya song, because it's in just about everything. Because there's like almost any of the spin-offs are going to have either a Shirou, like Archer maybe is in it, like some of the other games like Fate Extra or obviously Fate Grand Order, or there's like a Shirou-esque character. Like there are even echoes of that Emiya theme in one of the songs from Fate Zero. I think it's the song that plays when Kiritsugu fights Kodamine at the end. You get a little bit of it in there. So it's like just a version of the theme that has been done literally like dozens and dozens of times across the different games and the various anime adaptations. We're obviously going to get a version of it that plays at some points in Heaven's Feel. That's going to be very good. So yeah, it's a piece of music I really like, and it's hype as fuck when it shows up here.
Yes,
because it plays once that alarm that plays. You're like, okay, yeah, some shit's about to go down, and you are very like Pavlovianly trained by this franchise to get really hyped up whenever you hear that sound play.
It's so good. And yeah, I have to say, I spent the last week finishing Unlimited Blade Works and finishing the visual novel Mahotsukai no Yoru, Witch on the Holy Night, both of which lead composer was Hideyuki Fukasawa. So I have come to, that's a composer I hadn't heard much of before. Now I'm like, I love his music. There's so much good stuff in that visual novel, so much good stuff here. Really, really great score.
Yeah, absolutely. I think one of the characters that we didn't touch on a lot, and I want to talk about a little bit, even though she doesn't show up a huge amount in this show, but she has like some really good stuff in season 2, is Elia. Like she's only really in 2 episodes in season 2, but that whole section where you get her backstory of her getting berserker and like going out into the woods and like with the wolves and all that, like that's mostly original, because you get different versions of her of like a similar thing in the Fate route where Elia is a much more prominent character, but I've always found that they like everything that happens with Elia is just so fucking brutal in this show, and
it is.
And that episode is just like very haunting, because this is definitely like the darkest ending for Elia across the 3 routes, and so I think it's one of the things that Unlimited Blade Works as an anime struggles with a little bit, is that it just doesn't have the space to fully set her up as a character. But particularly if you know her, and obviously you know her a little bit from Fate Zero, it's very fucked up what happens to that girl.
It's extremely fucked up, but I love how they do the entire relationship with Berserker. It's almost this like Beauty and the Beast thing, with down to the wolves scene is obviously, that kind of scene happens in Beauty and the Beast. This is not a romance in that sense, but it's this protector person. And yeah, extremely tragic. And Shirou never, I think, even learned why she calls him Onisa.
No. Yeah. This is a route where that's one of the other things that makes him jumping out to try to save her really crazy, is because the only thing he knows her from is the one time she tried to murder him in Tosaka. That's the only relationship he has to her. Which is one of the things that's very dark about this story for her perspective, is that like she never learns anything about like Kiritsugu. She never learns why he never came back. Like Shirou never learns about his like relationship that he could have had with Elia. All that stuff is like lost in this version of the story. And then you have like Heracles Berserker here, which I think is another hero that I think they do a very good job of sort of realizing. I think the idea of him, like his sort of persistence, which is a big part of his myths, right, is that he has the 9 labors of Hercules that he has to overcome. And that being like sort of passed down as a noble phantasm that represents like these 9 lives that he has, that because you can never kill him, he never gets put down, I think is an interesting idea. And then if you know some of the Heracles myth, I think it really colors a lot of his relationship with Elia, where obviously since he's a berserker, he never talks. But one of the main things in Heracles' myth is that he kills his wife and daughter because he's tricked by Hera, who hates him because he's like a product of Zeus cheating on her. And so it's also, if people know the God of War games, it's basically where the Kratos backstory comes from. And so he is this man who unwillingly murdered his own family. And so he's very much, as they show him here, he's this like protector, father-like figure for Ilya, who Ilya is also missing a father because Kiritsuga never came back for her. And so I've always found it very touching, because I think if you know a little bit about the myth, you can see, I think there's like a lot it always feels like there's a lot going on behind Heracles' eyes in this show. It's true here. It's true of some of the stuff in Heaven's Feel as well, where even though he's a non-verbal character, there's clearly something more going on. He's much more rational than you would think, and he's much more rational than, say, like Lancelot is in Fate Zero.
Right. A couple other stray thoughts I had. I wish we got more Fujimura of Fujine, but given the events of this second season, it's probably for the best she's not in it much, because it's all dangerous, and I want her to be safe because she's wonderful. But still love Fujimura. Shinji, absolute piece of shit, but Hiroshi Kamiya has so much fun in this half of the show, because he's just either an absolute degenerate asshole, or he is shrieking in ungodly pain for several episodes, because his comeuppance is Gilgamesh just shoves Ilya's heart in him and he becomes a mass of abject flesh. And I like Hiroshi Kamiya just cutting loose on all of that, because it's very fun and gross and dark.
Yeah, it's really good, and Lancer just sort of like poking him with Gabolg and him just freaking the fuck out and bolting out of that room is a really great moment.
Another moment where Kamiya goes up into the penguin register from Polar Bear Cafe and makes me laugh very hard. It's so great. Yeah.
Yeah. Shinji is just like a legendary piece of shit, and it's very true here.
Yes, but I think, Tosaka is the bigger person for rescuing him, and even though I wouldn't have done it, but she's a better person than me, I guess.
It's the thing of where she's a lot more like Emiya than she likes to admit to herself, right?
Yes.
It's one of the things that makes their relationship work. It's why she admires him so much, because he's able to just be like that all the time, and she is like, too smart to be like that all the time, so she's constantly like kind of suppressing that part of herself.
Well, Sean, everything we've watched so far this season, Kara no Kyokai, Fate Zero, Unlimited Blade Works, it's been really great. Is that streak gonna continue for what we watch next?
Oh no, the Heaven's Feel movies are just garbage, Jonathan. There's just, I don't even know why we're watching them. I'm well on the record as saying, no, they're fucking, it's one of the things I'm most excited about, because I've only seen them once. So
they're relatively recent. They're like 2019 to 2021. Yeah.
So yes, I am extremely excited. They're just fucking great, and it's that thing of where I've said this multiple times, but it's just something that's worth repeating again, how lucky you are, Jonathan, that you just get to move on to it. Because I've always just been fascinated by imagining the hypothetical viewer who doesn't know that this game exists, doesn't know there's a whole other story, and watched all of Unlimited Blade Works just looking at the Sakura character being like, is nobody going to say a single fucking thing about the girl who's like Tosaka's little sister, who got taken by the crazy old man and thrown into the worm dungeon? Is nobody ever going to bring it up? Well, it's going to get brought up next time on Japanimation Station.
Japanimation Station.